A woman, alone in a Montana blizzard, carrying a tattered bag, walks into a cowboy camp with unwavering determination. They mock her. They say she'll freeze to death before dawn. But she only asks for a stove, a handful of flour, and one night to prove them wrong. That's Clara Whitmore, the woman the world abandoned, but who never gave up. Today's story will forever remind you of the power of dignity. Like and comment with the city you're viewing from, so I know how far my story has come. Don't leave, because the best is yet to come. The wind hit Iron Ridge like it had a grudge. It came down off the high ridges sometime before noon, and by the time Clara Whitmore crested the last hill on foot and caught her first real look at the ranch below, the temperature had dropped hard enough that her eyelashes had frost on them. Not the decorative kind that artists painted onto Christmas cards back east. The kind that made it hurt to blink. She stopped walking for exactly 4 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. Below, Iron Ridge Ranch spread across a shallow valley like something half built and half forgotten. A cluster of low timber structures, a long bunkhouse with smoke coming from one end, 2 large barns with their doors frozen open, a cookhouse set apart from the rest with a busted porch step that had been busted long enough that the snow had packed into the gap and turned to ice. A cattle pen ran the length of the eastern side, and maybe 30 head stood bunched together at the far corner of it, their breath rising in pale clouds above the fence line. Clara had been walking since before sunrise. Her boots had a hole in the left sole that she'd stuffed with a folded piece of brown paper that morning, and the paper had gone wet around mile 4 and stayed wet since. She could no longer feel her smallest 2 toes on that foot. She'd been telling herself since mile 7 that this was temporary. She picked up walking again and went down the hill. There was a man near the barn door splitting wood, and he saw her coming from a long way off. He didn't stop splitting. He just watched her come, setting each piece of pine on the block, bringing the axe down, kicking the halves aside, setting the next piece. She was still 50 yards out when he set the axe head on the ground and leaned on the handle and stared at her openly, not bothering to pretend otherwise. Clara walked past him without slowing. "Afternoon," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then behind her, "Cookhouse is that way." Like he thought she was lost. She wasn't lost. She'd been looking at the cookhouse since she came over the hill. She turned her head just enough. "I know where the cookhouse is. I'm looking for whoever runs this place." "That'd be Hatch." The man with the axe pointed at the bunkhouse. "He's in there." "Thank you." She kept walking. Child. The bunkhouse smelled like wet wool, tobacco, and the particular sourness of men who had been working in cold weather and hadn't had access to hot water in several days. Clara had smelled worse. She stepped through the door and let it bang shut behind her against the wind, and every head in the room turned. There were 8 of them, some sitting at the long table with coffee cups, one lying on a bunk with his hat over his face, 2 more playing cards near the small iron stove in the corner. They all looked at her with the same expression, not hostile exactly, but weighted with the kind of slow male assessment that Clara had learned to walk through without flinching when she was 17 years old and hadn't had much choice. She scanned the room once, quickly, cataloging. The man at the head of the table was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the ridges outside. He had the kind of stillness that came from authority, not the nervous energy of a man performing his rank, but the settled weight of someone who'd been in charge long enough that he'd stopped thinking about it. That was Hatch. Had to be. She walked toward him. "I'm not buying anything," Hatch said, before she'd reached the table. Not unkind, just definitive. "I'm not selling anything," Clara said. "I'm looking for work." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Then someone laughed. It came from the card table. A younger man, sandy-haired, with a smirk that had probably gotten him into trouble more than once and would again. "Work," the sandy-haired one said, drawing the word out. "What kind of work you figure you're good for out here, sweetheart?" "Cooking," Clara said. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Hatch. "We got a cook," Hatch said. "I heard you had a cook," Clara said. "I also heard he left 3 weeks ago, and you've been feeding 18 men on salt pork and whatever the hunting parties bring in, and 2 of your hands walked off last week because the food was bad enough. They'd rather try their luck in town in December." She paused. "I heard wrong?" Hatch looked at her for a moment. His expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind his eyes. Not respect yet, just recalculation. Where'd you hear that? Ridgeback Trading Post. Man there said you'd been buying nothing but dry goods and salt pork for 3 weeks, and that you came in last Tuesday looking like you hadn't slept in 2 days. She kept her voice neutral, just reciting information. I was there looking for work. He told me you needed a cook worse than you needed a new fence line. Hatch was quiet. The sandy-haired man at the card table wasn't. You walked here from Ridgeback? That's 9 miles in this weather. 11, Clara said. The main roads drifted over past the creek. I came around. More silence. Different quality this time. You cook? Hatch said. Better than whoever's been feeding you lately. That's not saying much. No, Clara agreed. It's not, which is why I'm not asking you to take my word for it. She'd had this part of the speech ready since mile 3, when she'd been working out what she was going to say to make this work. Give me your stove for tonight, whatever flour and supplies you have left. One night, you feed your men a proper meal, and you pay me whatever it's worth to you. If it's not worth anything, I walk out at sunrise and we're square. Hatch looked at her. He looked at the room. The man with the hat over his face on the bunk had pushed it up and was watching her too. You got anywhere else to go tonight? Hatch asked. It was the most honest question anyone had asked her in weeks. Clara considered lying. No, she said. He studied her face for another moment. Then he nodded, slow. You burned my cookhouse down. I'm charging you for it. Fair enough, I'm mad. The cookhouse was cold and the stove needed cleaning, and whoever had been in there last had left a pot on the back burner with something in it that had fossilized into a dark mass. Clara decided not to examine too closely. She got the fire going first. Then she went through what they had. It wasn't much. 2 sacks of flour, both still sealed, a bucket of lard, salt, and a little pepper, some dried beans that had been sitting long enough she had to check them by feel for weevils. About 1/3 of them went out. Half a wheel of hard cheese that was genuine but close to the edge. 3 smoked ham hocks. Dried apples in a crate, enough of them still good. Onions. Cornmeal. She stood in the middle of the cold cookhouse with her coat still on and her wet left foot going slowly numb again, and she thought about it. She'd learned to cook the way most women of her circumstances learned, out of necessity in situations where there wasn't enough. Where making a meal mean something required you to understand what each ingredient was capable of. Her mother had taught her that flour and water and a little lard was never just bread. It was comfort. It was warmth. It was the thing that made people sit down and stop worrying for 20 minutes. You didn't need expensive ingredients to feed people properly. You needed to understand what they were hungry for. And 18 cowboys who'd been eating salt pork for 3 weeks in Montana December were hungry for something warm, something that tasted like somebody had actually thought about them. She got to work. She didn't notice him until she turned around to get the second sack of flour and nearly ran directly into him. He was standing just inside the doorway, not lurking exactly, but quiet enough that she'd missed him coming in. Tall, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who worked hard without thinking about it. Maybe 30, or close to it. Dark hair under a battered hat. He had a burn scar on the back of his left hand that disappeared up under his sleeve, old and faded, and he was holding a piece of split kindling like he'd come to bring it and then just stopped. Clara took a step back on instinct. Then she held still. Cookhouse was getting low, he said. He held up the kindling like he was providing evidence. His voice was even, not particularly friendly, but not unfriendly either. Figured you could use it. I could, Clara said. Thank you. He set the kindling down near the wood box and didn't leave. He stood there with his hat brim still dripping a little from the snow outside, and he looked at the stove and the flour sacks and the ham hocks she'd set on the cutting board, and he looked at her. She met his eyes once, directly. Brown, she thought, or close to it. Hard to tell in the low light. He looked away first. You know what you're doing? He asked. Not dismissive, like it was a real question. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Then he left. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse and listened to his boots on the porch and didn't entirely understand why the brief silence he'd left behind felt different from all the other silence in the room. She put it aside and got back to work. His name was Rowan Hale, and he didn't talk much. She learned this over the next hour, when two of the other cowboys drifted in and out of the cookhouse on various pretexts. One to ask if she needed more wood, she did. One to ask if the ham hocks were going into the beans, they were. And both of them mentioned him in passing. Quiet fella, that Rowan. Been here 2 years, keeps to himself. One of them said it with admiration, the other with the mild suspicion men sometimes have for people who don't need to fill every silence with noise. What she noticed over the course of the evening was this. Every time one of the other ranch hands came through the cookhouse door and said something that wasn't exactly respectful, and several of them did, ranging from mildly presumptuous to the sandy-haired one's particular brand of commentary, which tended toward observations about her figure and her future, Rowan Hale appeared somewhere nearby not long after, not charging in, not making a scene, just present, leaning against the porch rail with a coffee cup, sitting on the chopping block outside, sharpening a knife. Close enough that his presence registered. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She had bigger things to think about. By 6 o'clock, the cookhouse smelled like something real. She'd made bean soup with the ham hocks and onion and a pull of dried thyme she'd found in a tin someone had left on a shelf and forgotten about. Cornbread baked directly in the skillet, 4 batches of it, golden on top where the fat had crisped. Fried apple slices with a scraping of the hard cheese shaved over them while they were still hot, which was a thing she'd watched her mother do and which sounded wrong until you tasted it. And biscuits, proper biscuits with the lard worked cold into the flour, cut with the rim of a tin cup because there was no biscuit cutter, baked until they were just brown on the top and still soft in the middle. It wasn't a fancy meal. It wasn't anything she would have been proud of under ordinary circumstances, meaning circumstances where she had adequate supplies and a working kitchen and more than 4 hours. But it was warm, and it was filling, and it smelled like someone had cooked it on purpose. The men came in from the cold and sat down, and for the first minute or so, they were mostly quiet in the way men get quiet when they're surprised and don't want to show it. The sandy-haired one, she'd learned his name was Pete Dunmore, and she'd already identified him as the variety of man who required constant management, took his first spoonful of the soup and made a sound low in his throat that he immediately tried to pass off as a cough. "It's decent," said a man named Callum, who appeared to be the most senior of the Cowboys after Hatch, and who had a face like a sun-dried apple and said everything with the same flat effect regardless of meaning. "Decent," Pete said, already on his second biscuit. "Sure." Clara stood at the end of the long table and watched them eat. She was still in her coat. Her left foot had mostly come back to feeling, which was a mixed blessing. She was so tired she could feel it behind her eyes. Hatch looked up at her from the head of the table. He had the soup and the bread, and he'd been eating steadily without comment, and now he looked at her with the same evaluating expression he'd had since she walked in. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "Before Ridgeback?" "Billings," Clara said. "Before that, further east." "You got people here?" "No." "What happened to your last position?" "The family I was working for decided they didn't need a cook for the winter," Clara said. "They told me in October, and I've been working my way west since." It was true. It was not the complete truth, but it was true, and she'd gotten good at staying inside the edges of what was true without having to navigate the full map of it. Hatch nodded. "You do this all yourself tonight?" "Yes." He looked at the table. The cornbread was almost gone. The soup pot had been passed twice. "What do you want for it?" "Fair pay for fair work," Clara said. "Whatever you think that is." Hatch was quiet for a moment. $2 for tonight," he said. "If I want you to stay on, we talk terms in the morning." $2 was generous. Clara didn't let her face show what that meant to her right now. "That's fair," she said. She was washing out the soup pot when she heard someone come back in. She didn't turn around. She'd learned not to be too quick to turn around when she didn't know who was coming. "I can finish that." It was him, Rowan Hale, with his coat still on and snow on his shoulders like he'd just come in from outside. Clara looked at him over her shoulder. "I'm almost done." "I can see that." He didn't move toward her. He stood in the doorway. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" She set the pot on the shelf, turned around fully. "I'll figure something out." He shook his head, not impatient, more like he'd expected this answer, and it was a problem. "It's going to be 20 below by midnight. You can't sleep in here. The fire won't hold that long without tending." "I'll tend it." You've been on your feet since before sunrise, he said. You tend that stove half the night, and you'll be useless tomorrow, and Hatch will think twice about keeping you on. Clara looked at him. He wasn't wrong about the math, and she disliked that. What's your suggestion? There's a storage room off the back of the barn, he said. Small. It's got insulation in the walls because it used to be a tack room, and they kept the leather goods there. Holds heat better than you'd expect. I've slept there myself when the bunkhouse gets loud. He paused. It's clean. Nobody's been in it since fall. She studied his face. He wasn't doing anything in particular with it, not trying to be charming, not watching her in the way that men sometimes watched women they meant to manipulate into gratitude. He looked tired, if anything, like he was solving a practical problem. Why? She asked. He seemed to consider the question genuinely. Because you cooked a real meal tonight, he said finally, and you walked 11 miles in December to do it. That seems like something worth not letting freeze to death. It was such a plainly practical answer that Clara almost laughed. Instead, she dried her hands on the front of her coat. All right, she said. Show me. So, the tack room was exactly what he'd said. Small, with straw on the floor and old blankets on a shelf that smelled of leather and hay. The insulation in the walls was rough-cut wool batting tacked up sometime in the past decade. Rowan lit a small lantern and hung it on the nail and produced a second blanket from somewhere and laid it over the first without comment. There's a latch on the inside, but, he said, indicating it. Use it. I intended to, Clara said. He nodded. He picked up the lantern to adjust the flame down to something that would last. In the low orange light, the burn scar on his left hand was more visible. It curved from the back of his knuckles up toward his wrist, smooth and old. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't her business, and she knew better than to make it so. He set the lantern back on its nail, moved toward the door. Rowan, she said. He stopped. She wasn't sure why she'd said his name. It had come out before she'd decided on it. Thank you, she said, for the wood earlier, and this. He looked at her for a moment. Something passed across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition, but something in that neighborhood. And then it was gone, replaced by his regular expression, which was mostly just neutral. Get some sleep, he said. Hatch will want breakfast early. He closed the door behind him. Clara latched it, just as he'd said, and sat down on the straw and pulled the blankets around her, and did not sleep for almost an hour because her mind wouldn't stop moving. She'd been in enough places to know when a man was being decent because he wanted something in return, and when he was being decent because he was, under the surface of things, a decent person. She wasn't sure yet which category Rowan Hale fell into. She was also not sure why she was spending so much thought on it. She lay back and closed her eyes and listened to the wind work itself against the barn walls, and eventually the cold and the exhaustion won out over the thinking, and she slept. She was up before 5. The wind had dropped sometime in the night, and the cold had gotten cleaner, more still. The kind of cold that didn't push against you, but just settled around you like fact. Clara built the cookhouse fire back up, started water heating, and went through the supplies again with fresh eyes. There was oatmeal she hadn't seen the night before, pushed to the back of the shelf. Enough of it. She found a jar of sorghum molasses half full. Salt pork she'd disregarded the night before now looked more useful. She started the oatmeal and cut the pork thin and let it fry down in the skillet until it crisped, and put the rendered fat to use in a second skillet for eggs. There were eggs, a crate of them she found under the work table, brought in recently enough they were still good. The smell brought them in the way the smell always brought them in. Cowboys were not complicated about breakfast. Hot food equaled warmth, equaled willingness to work through whatever the day brought. Claire had learned this early and used it deliberately. The sandy-haired Pete Dunmore came in first, stamping snow off his boots, and stopped when he saw the skillet. "You're still here," he said. "Evidently," Clara said. "Hatch keeping you on?" "We're discussing terms this morning." Pete sat down and pulled a bowl toward him. He was quiet for a moment, which was either a good sign or meant he was thinking of something to say that she wouldn't like. It turned out to be the latter, but mildly. He just said, while helping himself to the oatmeal, "You handle yourself pretty good for someone who walked in out of a blizzard." "Thank you," Clara said, in the tone she used for statements that were technically compliments but had other things folded inside them. "Where'd you say you came from?" "I didn't," Clara said pleasantly, and turned back to the skillet. She heard the door again behind her and didn't turn. "Morning," Rowan's voice. He sounded like he'd been up for a while, not the roughened edge of someone just woken, but the flat clarity of someone who'd already put in an hour of cold. "Morning," Clara said. He sat down at the far end of the table from Pete, and she brought eggs and put them in front of him, and he said thank you, the way he said everything, without inflection, just meaning it. Callum came in, and two others she hadn't learned the names of yet, and then the rest of them over the next 20 minutes, and Clara fed them all and kept the fire going and didn't stop moving. Fawcett. Hatch found her at 7:30 when the breakfast rush had cleared and she was scrubbing the egg skillet. He sat down at the table without ceremony, poured himself coffee from the pot, and looked at her. $5 a week, he said. 3 meals a day, 6 days. Sunday you do what you want. You sleep in the storeroom off the barn. Rowan tell you about that? He did. That all right with you? If it's got a latch. Hatch almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it almost did. It's got a latch. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. You had other places offer you more. You take them. I won't hold it against you, but you stay through February. I'll give you a bonus at the end of it. Clara considered. $5 a week was reasonable. Not generous, but reasonable. February was 2 months away. What kind of bonus? Depends how February goes. That's not much to go on. No, Hatch said. It's not. She looked at him. He looked at her. It was the kind of negotiation where neither party was pretending to have more leverage than they had, which she found she preferred to the alternative. All right, she said. $5 a week through February. We revisit in March. Hatch nodded like this was what he'd expected. He stood up, drank the rest of the coffee standing, set the cup down. One thing, he said. Clara waited. The men here, he said. Most of them are decent. Some of them are less so. I run a ranch, not a schoolhouse. I can't be watching every interaction. He paused. You have a problem. You come to me. Don't try to handle it yourself. Not because you can't, but because it makes things complicated. Clara looked at him steadily. I've been handling things myself for a long time, Mr. Hatch. I imagine you have, he said. I'm asking you to try it the other way for a while. He picked up his hat. You start earning your $5 today. He left. Clara stood in the cookhouse alone for a moment, looking at the fire in the stove and the cleaned-up evidence of the morning's work and the thin winter light coming through the one small window. She'd been in worse situations. She'd been in a lot of them. This was a roof and a wage and a stove she could control. And the man who ran the place seemed fair, and the work was work she was good at. It was enough. It was what she had. She would make it into more. She picked up the skillet and started planning the midday meal. The days settled into shape the way days do when there's structure to them. She was up before 5 every morning. Fire first, always. The cookhouse stove had a temperament. It liked to be started a certain way or it smoked, and she learned its moods within the first 3 days. Breakfast by 6, midday meal at noon, supper at 6 in the evening. Between meals, there was the sourcing and prep. She'd made an inventory of what they had and put together a list for Hatch of what they needed, which he'd looked at briefly and handed to Callum to take to Ridgeback on the next supply run. The men responded to consistency. Some of them were still awkward around her. Not hostile, just unsure. The way men sometimes got around women in situations they hadn't been in before. She ignored that. A few of them made a point of being helpful in small ways. Callum always brought extra wood for the cookhouse without being asked, starting the second week. A quiet, older man named Abe, who appeared to do the work of 2 people without drawing attention to it, fixed the busted porch step within a few days of her arriving, which she appreciated more than she said. Rowan Hale continued to be exactly what he appeared to be, a man who worked hard, said little, and moved through the world as though he was thinking about something privately most of the time. He brought wood when the box got low. He didn't linger. He didn't make small talk. Occasionally in the evenings after supper, when some of the men sat around the table playing cards or arguing about nothing in particular, he'd sit at the far end with a cup of coffee and be present in the room without being part of the conversation, and Clara would feel him watching her sometimes when she was cleaning up. And when she looked, he'd already be looking elsewhere. She didn't know what to make of it. She'd given up trying. Botat. The incident with Pete Dunmore happened on the 8th day. It wasn't the first time he'd pushed at things. He'd been probing the edges of appropriate since she arrived, the way certain men did, testing to see where the borders were and whether they'd hold. She'd managed it the way she'd learned to manage it. Short responses, flat tone, no acknowledgement of the intent behind the words. On the 8th day, he came into the cookhouse in the afternoon when she was alone working on pie dough. Hatch had mentioned offhand that his mother used to make dried apple pie, and Clara had taken that as the invitation it was. And he came in with the specific energy of a man who'd been thinking about something and had decided to say it. "Need to ask you something," Pete said. "Go ahead," Clara said, without looking up. She was cutting the lard into the flour, and the ratio had to be right or the crust would be wrong. "Word's going around," he said. He sat down at the table without being invited. "From some of the fellas who've been through Billings recent, they're saying—" He paused, and she could hear him organizing his words. "They're saying you worked at a place called the Monarch. That right?" Clara kept her hands moving. She kept her face neutral. "What's the Monarch?" she said. "You know what it is?" She looked up then. She looked at him directly, and she kept her face very still. "I know what you're implying," she said. "You should know that I find it tiresome." "I'm not implying anything," Pete said. "I'm asking a direct question." "You are," she said, "and I'm choosing not to answer it." She looked back down at the dough. "You want something from the kitchen? I'm happy to help you. Otherwise, I have work to do." Pete was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding how to play this. "It's the kind of thing the men would want to know," he said. "That's all." If I'm what?" Clara said. "Still flat. Still even." "Finish the sentence, Pete. Say exactly what you mean." He didn't finish it, which meant he knew what it was. That the words he was reaching for would sound ugly out loud, and he didn't quite have the nerve for that version of himself. He pushed back from the table and stood up. "Just saying what people are talking about," he said, and left. Clara stood at the work table with her hands still in the flour and the pie dough starting to come together under her palms, and she breathed out slowly through her nose, and she finished the crust. She did not go to Hatch. She'd said she handled things herself for a long time, and she meant it. What she hadn't anticipated was how fast things moved. By the next morning, she felt it. Not in any single action. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody did anything she could point to. It was more like a change in weather, something atmospheric. Men who'd been easy with her the week before were suddenly looking elsewhere when she came in. Conversation stopped in a certain way when she walked through it. Two of the younger cowboys who'd been in the habit of stopping by the cookhouse in the afternoon for coffee stopped coming. It was the silence that was hardest. She knew how to respond to something said out loud. Silence required you to just keep moving through it as though you didn't feel it, which was its own particular skill. She kept the meals good. She kept the fire going. She kept her face right and her voice level, and she did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing it land. But it landed. It always landed. She was carrying water from the pump one afternoon, the bucket heavy in both hands, her breath coming in short white clouds, when she heard it. She was still 20 yards from the cookhouse. Pete and two others were on the bunkhouse porch, not looking at her, talking among themselves, but their voices carried. "What places like the Monarch pay?" Pete was saying. "I heard it was real good money." Laughter, not loud, but pointed. "How much for a home-cooked meal, you figure?" The other voice. She didn't know which one. More laughter. Clara kept walking. She did not spill the water. She got to the cookhouse and set the buckets down on the floor just inside the door and stood for a moment with her hands on her knees and her eyes closed and waited for the thing that was happening in her chest to settle back down into something manageable. She heard the cookhouse door open behind her. She straightened up fast and turned. Rowan Hale was standing inside the doorway with his hat in his hands, and she could tell from the set of his jaw that he'd heard it too. They looked at each other across the cookhouse. "I don't need—" she started. "I know you don't," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. "The beans need sorting," she said finally. "All right," he said. He sat down at the work table and started sorting beans, and she got the water onto heat, and they worked in the same room in silence, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it helped. Well, 3 days later, it was Pete again. This time she was serving supper, moving along the table with the pot, and Pete made a comment, low enough that she couldn't quite catch the words, but loud enough that the two men beside him laughed and looked at her in a way that made the meaning clear enough. She set the pot down on the table. She heard the bench scrape at the far end of the room. Before she could do anything, Rowan was on his feet. He crossed the distance between himself and Pete in about 4 steps, not rushing, and he grabbed Pete by the front of his shirt and pulled him half out of his seat and said something to him in a voice too low for Clara to make out the words. Pete's face went from startled to pale over the course of about 2 seconds. Rowan let him go, stepped back. His face was entirely calm, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd looked angry. The room was completely silent. Rowan picked up his coffee cup from his spot at the table, walked back to the far end, and sat down. Nobody said anything. Pete stared at his plate. Someone cleared their throat. Supper resumed. Clara picked up the pot and kept serving, and when she reached Rowan's end of the table, she set his plate in front of him without a word, and he nodded once without looking up. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't sure how. She also wasn't sure what to do with the fact that he'd stepped in where she hadn't been able to, where she'd been standing there with the pot in her hands and the words not quite in her reach, and it had been him who'd crossed the room. She didn't know if she was grateful or angry or something more complicated than either of those. She suspected it was the more complicated thing. That night, sitting in the tack room with the lantern turned low and the wind working outside and the blankets pulled around her, Clara thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew. Rowan Hale had been at this ranch for 2 years. He worked like he had something to prove and kept company with no one in particular. He brought wood when the box was low and sorted beans without being asked, and apparently physically relocated men who said things he objected to. She didn't know. Why? Why any of it? Why he'd watched her from the moment she walked in, why that thing passed across his face sometimes when he looked at her. That thing that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite recognition, but sat in that neighborhood. She thought about asking him. She decided against it. There were things she knew about herself that she didn't volunteer, and she figured she had to extend the same courtesy to others. Whatever it was his to keep or his to tell. She turned out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her. The cattle moving in the pen, the barn making its small sounds, the distant mutter of the bunkhouse where someone was still up. And she thought, you've made it through worse than this. She had. She was still here. For now, that was enough. The apple pie turned out well. She hadn't expected it to matter as much as it did. It was a practical thing, filling a gap in the menu, using the dried apples before they went entirely soft. But when she set the 2 pans on the table after supper on the 9th day, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something catches people off guard, she understood that it had crossed some invisible line between cooking as function and cooking as something else. Callum made his peace without a word and then looked at the pan for a long moment in a way that was almost mournful, like he was doing math on how much was left and how many men were still at the table. "Your mother teach you this?" Abe asked. He was a man of few questions, so when he asked one, it tended to mean something. "She did," Clara said. Abe nodded. He didn't say anything else, but he ate slowly, in a way she recognized, the way people eat things that remind them of somewhere they can't go back to. That was the 9th day. The warmth that had been building between Clara and the ranch hands over the first week and a half felt, by then, like something she could lean on slightly. Not trust, exactly. She was too experienced to call it that this soon. But something. A working arrangement that had started to take on the texture of mutual respect. She knew, looking back on it later, that she should have understood how quickly that kind of thing can change. She'd seen it before. She knew better. She just hadn't been braced for it happening here. The 10th morning, Pete Dunmore rode out early on an errand into Ridgeback and came back in the afternoon with the supply run and something else. Some cargo that didn't arrive in the wagon, but traveled inside him, in the particular way that gossip travels, which is lighter than it looks, and impossible to put back once it's moving. She didn't know what he'd heard or who he'd heard it from. She'd worked hard over the past year to put distance between herself and certain chapters of her life, and she'd believed, arriving here in the cold and the snow, that she'd put enough miles between herself and any version of the story that could follow her. The frontier was supposed to be a place where a person could start over. Everyone said so. People came west specifically because the east had gotten too small to contain their mistakes. What they didn't tell you was that the frontier was also a small place in its own way, made of trading posts and supply routes and men who passed through the same towns and talked to each other across the same bars, and that a story, once it found its legs, could outrun a person walking. She first noticed the change the following morning. It was small, the way a change in weather is small at first, just a shift in the quality of light or the direction of the wind before it becomes undeniable. Two of the younger hands who'd been easy with her the week before, a pair of cousins named Dell and Marcus, who'd been competing with each other about who got to bring her more wood, came in for breakfast and sat at the far end of the table and didn't look at her directly. Dell said, "Thanks," when she put the eggs in front of him, the way you say thanks to someone you don't know. The week before, he'd been telling her about his family's spread down in Wyoming like she was someone he'd known for years. By supper that evening, the shift had spread. She moved through it without changing her expression. She'd learned this early, that the moment you acknowledged the change, you gave it power. You made it real in a way that let other people see you knew it was happening. And once people saw that, the knowing became part of the story too. So she kept her face right, kept the food coming, kept the coffee hot, and watched the room reorganize itself around her the way a field reorganizes around a stone. The only person whose behavior didn't change was Callum, who was too set in his ways to shift for anything short of an earthquake, and Abe, who appeared not to participate in the social weather of the bunkhouse as a matter of principle, and Rowan Hale, who was exactly the same as he'd always been, which was to say present, steady, and watching her with that private expression she still hadn't been able to read. She noticed, too, that Rowan noticed the change around her. He wasn't oblivious. She was starting to understand that he was almost constitutionally incapable of being oblivious, that he tracked things in a room the way a man tracks weather on the horizon, out of long habit and some internal necessity. He saw what was happening. He didn't say anything about it. But on the evening of the 11th day, she came out of the cookhouse to find that someone had repaired the split in the wood on the bottom porch step, the one that had been catching on her boot when she came out with heavy pots. It had been fixed recently, the new wood still clean, no frost on it yet. She hadn't asked anyone to fix it. She looked at it for a long moment, then went back inside. The next morning, there was a small crock of rendered fat on her work table that she hadn't put there. It was the good kind, clear and clean. And there was more of it than she had. It would make better pastry than what she'd been working with. There was no note and no explanation, and she didn't ask. She used it because wasting a practical thing as a matter of pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Pete was quiet for several days. She'd give him that. Whatever he'd heard and whoever he'd told, he seemed, for a period, to understand that he'd activated something he might not be able to fully control, and there was a version of him that looked almost uncomfortable about it. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that was difficult to read, not apologetic exactly, because she suspected Pete Dunmore had not spent much time in his life being apologetic, but something adjacent to it. Uneasy, maybe. It didn't last. It was the 14th day, a Sunday. Her day off, technically, the day Hatch had said she could do as she liked. And she'd used the morning to wash her spare clothes and hang them in the tack room near the small heat source. And she was sitting on an upturned crate just outside the cookhouse door with a cup of coffee, doing nothing in particular, which was the closest thing to rest she'd managed in 2 weeks. The sun was out. It made the snow bright enough to hurt and gave the air a false warmth that wasn't really there, but she lifted her face to it anyway. Pete came out of the bunkhouse with a couple of others, and they stopped near the pump, and she wasn't close enough to catch everything they said, but she caught enough to understand that whatever story he'd brought back from Ridgeback, he was still carrying it and setting it down for people to look at. She heard her name. She heard the word monarch. She heard something else she couldn't make out, followed by laughter. She set down her coffee cup. She stood up. She walked over to the pump. Pete saw her coming and didn't look away, which told her he'd known she was there. The two men with him saw her and went quiet. "I'd like to know what you're telling people," Clara said. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She'd learned a long time ago that controlled was always more effective than angry, even when angry was what you actually were. Pete met her eyes. "Nothing that isn't true," he said. "You don't know what's true," Clara said. You heard something in a saloon from someone who heard it from someone else, and you carried it back here and repeated it, and you don't actually know anything. I know what the monarch is, Pete said. Anybody who spent time in Billings knows what the monarch is. Then you know it's a saloon that serves food, Clara said. You know it has a kitchen. You know that kitchens require cooks. Sure, Pete said. Cooks. The pause he put before it, and the way he looked at the other two men when he said it, was enough. Clara felt the heat come up in her face and pushed it back down. You're making a decision right now, she said, about what kind of man you are in this situation. I want you to think about it, because once you say the thing you're thinking of saying, you won't be able to unsay it, and what happens after that isn't something I can predict. She held his eyes. So I'm asking you to think. Pete looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face, something that might, under different circumstances, in a different man, have been caution. Then he smiled. Small, sideways. Just saying what I heard, he said. Clara looked at him for one more second, then she turned and walked back to the cookhouse and went inside and closed the door and stood with her back against it and breathed. The isolation that followed was more total than she'd expected. By the end of the second week, it had a shape. Callum still brought wood without comment, but he didn't make conversation the way he had before, and she understood without being told that Callum was a man who kept his head down in situations that weren't his, and that this one he'd decided wasn't his. Abe continued to be Abe, courteous, consistent, almost aggressively uninvolved in the social texture of the place. But he wasn't the type to actively push back against anything either. The younger hands were largely following the temperature set by Pete and the older cowboys who'd shifted away from her. The meals she kept excellent. This was deliberate. It was also, she recognized, a stubbornness that verged on the irrational. She was cooking her best food for men who were treating her like something to be managed around, and the part of her that was practical and self-preserving kept asking why she was bothering. The part of her that had walked 11 miles in a December blizzard on a bad left foot to prove she could do this job told the practical part to be quiet. She wasn't going to make their food worse because they were treating her badly. That would have meant the treatment had gotten to her. It had gotten to her. She wasn't going to show it. The hardest parts were the mornings. Mornings were when her defenses were lowest. Before she'd gotten the fire going and the work organized and the day structured around her, there was a period of maybe 20 minutes in the cold cookhouse when she was just herself, tired and increasingly worn, and the weight of the things settled on her more completely than she usually allowed. She'd come a long way. She'd done what she said she could do. And it was still, somehow, not enough. Because a man had ridden into town and come back with a story, and the story had been enough to undo 2 weeks of careful, honest work. She'd been through this before. She knew how it worked. But knowing the mechanism didn't make it lighter. On the 16th day, she was carrying 2 buckets of water from the pump to the cookhouse, her regular morning task before the fire got the inside water warm enough to use. And she walked past the group near the bunkhouse door and heard it clearly this time, not just fragments. Wonder what else she can cook up, Pete said, and the men around him laughed. Clara set 1 bucket down on the icy ground. She picked it up again. She kept walking. Inside the cookhouse, she set both buckets by the stove and stood with her hands on the work table and looked at the surface of the wood, the grain of it, a deep cut in the edge where someone had used it as a chopping block years ago. And she held herself very still and waited for the worst of it to pass. The door opened behind her. She heard the familiar sound of his boots on the plank floor. A particular cadence, unhurried, she'd learned to recognize it without thinking about it. Don't, she said, without turning around. Rowan stopped. Don't say anything sympathetic, she said. I can't use it right now. A pause. All right, he said. She heard him move, not leaving, just repositioning. He sat down on the bench by the door. She heard the slight creak of the wood. She stood at the work table and breathed and got her face back in order. Then she turned around. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He looked up when she turned, and he didn't say anything. Why are you still doing this? She asked. She didn't mean it to come out as blunt as it did. It came out blunt. Doing what? Showing up, she said. The wood, the fat in the crock, the porch step. She gestured in the general direction of the door. All of it. You're the only person in this place who's still behaving like a human being toward me. And I don't know why. And I need to know why because I can't figure out whether it's something I should be grateful for or something I should be wary of. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He kept turning the hat. It's something you should take at face value, he said. People don't do things at face value, Clara said. They do things for reasons. Sure, he said. The reason is that what Pete's doing is wrong and somebody should say so. And since the people who could say so aren't saying it, the least a person can do is not participate in it. Clara looked at him. That's it. That's most of it, he said. What's the rest? He looked up from the hat, met her eyes directly, which he didn't always do. The rest isn't something I'm ready to say yet, he said. When I am, I'll say it. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood at the work table and thought about pushing and decided against it. He'd said what he was able to say. She'd heard it. All right, she said finally. He stood up, put his hat on, moved toward the door. Rowan, he stopped. For what it's worth, she said. I see it. What you're doing. I want you to know that. He nodded once. His hand was on the door handle. I know you do, he said. Get the fire going before those buckets freeze. He went out. Clara stood there for another moment, something odd and warm moving in her chest that she didn't particularly want to name, and then she got the fire going like he said. The incident that broke things open happened on the 18th day, in the early afternoon, and she was not expecting it. She was in the cookhouse working on a lamb stew. Hatch had had 2 sheep come in, and she was doing what she could with the cuts. And Pete came in with 2 others she recognized as being in his general orbit. His mood was different than usual. She clocked it immediately. Not his regular probing quality, but something looser, more careless, the thing men sometimes carried when they'd been at a bottle. And the inhibitions that usually slowed their worst impulses had thinned out. She kept working. Smells good, Pete said. He sat down at the table uninvited. The other 2 stood. Stew will be ready at 6, Clara said, same as always. Just saying it smells good, Pete said. Can a man pay you a compliment? She didn't answer. She kept her attention on the stew. Must be something, cooking all day, Pete said. Working for these wages. When you could be... Stop there, Clara said. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. She set the spoon down on the board and turned around to face him. You've been saying it for a week and a half in different ways. I've heard it every time. I'd like you to hear me now clearly, once. What you think you know about me, or about where I've been, or about what I've done, you don't know it. You have a story you heard in a saloon from men who were drinking and who didn't know me and who were talking about a version of my life that has nothing to do with who I am. And I am tired, she said, of being measured against someone else's story. Pete looked at her. The loose quality in his eyes was still there, but something else too. A meanness that she thought was probably in him all the time and was just more visible right now. See, the thing is, he said, it's not just a story if it's true. And then he said what he'd been circling for 2 weeks. He said it plainly, in front of the 2 men standing behind him, and the words hung in the cold air of the cookhouse, and Clara felt them land the way she always felt these things land, in the chest, where the defenses were thinnest. She didn't move. She kept very still. The door opened. Rowan came in. He took one look at her face, one look at Pete, and the calculation was so fast it was almost invisible. He crossed the room in 5 steps, got Pete by the collar and the arm, pulled him up and out of the chair with the kind of ease that meant he'd done it before, and walked him backward into the far wall of the cookhouse. Not slamming him, not throwing him, just moving him, firmly, out of the space he'd been occupying, until Pete's back was against the wall, and Rowan was standing too close to him, not loud, not performing for the audience. Get out, Rowan said. His voice was very quiet. Take your friends and get out, and the next time you think about opening your mouth about this woman, you come find me first and say it to my face and see how that goes. Pete's face had gone a particular shade. Not pale, red, the red of a man who's been physically handled and doesn't know how to process it, and is deciding whether he's angry enough to escalate. He decided he wasn't. Rowan stepped back. Pete straightened his collar. The 2 men by the door had already made their decision and were on their way out. Pete followed them without another word, not looking at Clara, not looking at Rowan. The door closed. Clara and Rowan were alone in the cookhouse. The stew made small sounds on the back of the stove. The fire cracked. The cold light came in through the small window and lay across the floor. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said. "I know," Rowan said. "I was handling it." "I know that too." She looked at him. He was facing the door Pete had left through, not looking at her, his jaw set in a way that told her the calmness was a thing he was maintaining deliberately. His left hand was at his side, the burn scar visible at the cuff, and she noticed his fingers were slightly closed, not a fist, but close. "Why?" she asked. Third time she'd asked him some version of this question. She was starting to wonder if she'd ever get a complete answer. Rowan turned to look at her. The something she'd been seeing in his face for weeks was there again, clearer now, closer to the surface. Guilt, she thought, or something that had the same weight as guilt, the same pull downward. "There's something I owe you," he said. "That's not the right way to put it. There's something I need to say to you that I haven't been able to say yet." Clara waited. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He shook his head once, slow. "Not now," he said. "When I say it, I want to say it right, not when you've just had to stand there and take that from him." It was the most words he'd put together at once since she'd arrived. She looked at him and she felt something complicated moving through her, gratitude and distrust and something else she wasn't naming, all of it mixed together so thoroughly she couldn't separate them. "All right," she said, because there wasn't anything else to say. He nodded. He looked at the stew. "You need anything for supper?" "I need to be left alone to finish it," she said. "Sure," he said. He moved toward the door, stopped. "Clara." "What?" "You don't have to keep proving it," he said. "You already proved it, the first night." She didn't have an answer for that. He left before she had to find one. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse and picked up the spoon and went back to the stew, and the words stayed with her in the particular way that simple, honest things stay with you. Not because they fix anything, but because they're so rarely said. That evening, Hatch came to find her after supper, when the dishes were done and the fire banked and the cookhouse was quiet. He sat down at the table and she sat across from him, and he looked at her with the direct, measuring expression she'd learned was just how he looked at things he was trying to understand. "You doing all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her. "I told you to come to me if you had a problem." "I don't have a problem I can't manage." "Pete Dunmore," Hatch said. She met his eyes. "Pete Dunmore said something I didn't like." Rowan Hale expressed his objection. "It's handled." Hatch was quiet for a moment. What Rowan told him... "I didn't ask Rowan to say anything," Clara said. "I know you didn't." Hatch turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "That's not what I'm saying." He paused. "What Pete's been telling people. I want you to know I don't put weight on it." Clara looked at him. "Why not?" "Because I've watched you work for 2.5 weeks," he said. "And because I've met enough people to know that what a person does matters more than what somebody else says about them." He shrugged. "Also because Ridgeback's full of men who exaggerate." She didn't say anything for a moment. She was surprised, more than she wanted to be, by the simple directness of it. "I appreciate that," she said. "Pete'll settle down," Hatch said. "Men like that usually do once they understand what the lines are." "Rowan made the lines reasonably clear," Clara said. Something moved at the corner of Hatch's mouth. "He has a way of doing that." He stood up. "You're through February regardless. That's settled. What happens after that depends on you and me both." He left. Clara sat in the empty cookhouse with the lamp burning low and the fire settling in the stove, and she let the evening's events arrange themselves in her mind without forcing them into any particular shape. She didn't fully trust it, not yet. The treatment of the past week and a half had left something behind, a kind of residue, the way cold leaves a residue even after you're inside and warm. You can still feel where it was. She'd been in enough places to know that Hatch's confidence and Pete's chastening might change things, or they might not, and until she'd seen which way it went, she wasn't going to assume. But she was still here, she was still cooking, she hadn't run. She blew out the lamp and went through the cold to the tack room, and she lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settling into night, and thought about what Rowan had said. You don't have to keep proving it. She'd been proving things her whole life. She wasn't sure she knew how to stop. She wasn't sure she trusted a world where she didn't have to. But the thought stayed there, in the dark, warm and slightly uncomfortable. like something that was true that she hadn't finished understanding yet. Outside, the wind had dropped entirely for the first time in days. The cold was absolute and still. The ranch was quiet. She pulled the blankets up and closed her eyes. And in the morning, she would get up and build the fire and make breakfast and do it all again, and whatever came with it, she'd face the same way she'd faced all of it. By staying, by working, by refusing to be made smaller than she was. It was all she had. For now, it was enough. The weeks after Pete's chastening were quieter, but quiet on the frontier is rarely simple. Pete Dunmore did what men of his type usually did after being physically corrected in front of an audience. He pulled back, reorganized, and waited. He didn't apologize to Clara, which she hadn't expected. He didn't make any more comments within her hearing, which she had expected, because men like Pete understood the calculus of risk, and Rowan had made the math clear. What he did instead was subtler. He became pleasant, not warm, not engaged, but the performed version of neutral that certain men deploy when they want to appear reasonable, while the thing they've set in motion continues moving without them. And it was still moving. She could feel it. The temperature inside the bunkhouse had changed somewhat after Hatch's conversation with her and whatever he'd said to Pete afterward. She hadn't been present for that conversation and didn't ask about it, but change didn't mean restored. The men who'd pulled away from her during the worst of it came back part way, like a tide that had gone out and returned, but not quite to the same waterline. Dell and Marcus started coming by the cookhouse again in the afternoons, but they were careful now in a way they hadn't been before. And careful had its own kind of distance built into it. She fed them well. She kept the cookhouse clean and the fire going and the meals on time. She did not let any of it show on her face. And Rowan continued to be exactly what he'd been, which was the one constant in the place she'd come to rely on without quite deciding to. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't change his behavior in any way that announced itself. He was still quiet, still brief in conversation, still moving through the ranch with the contained quality of a man carrying something he hadn't set down in a long time. But he was there. The woodbox never ran empty. The water barrel outside the cookhouse door never froze solid because someone had been breaking the ice on it in the mornings before she got there. These were small things. She noticed all of them. What she still didn't know, and what had started to occupy more of her thinking than she was entirely comfortable with, was what he'd meant when he said there was something he needed to tell her. He hadn't said it again. She hadn't asked. The moment had passed, and they'd both let it pass. And in the weeks since, she'd been watching him for some sign that he was working toward it and finding nothing she could read clearly. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that whatever it was his business, and she had enough of her own to attend to. She told herself that, and mostly believed it. January deepened. The cold became a different kind of cold. Not the aggressive, punishing cold of December that seemed to want something from you, but a settled, permanent cold that had given up wanting and simply was. The cattle moved less. The men moved less. The days had a slow, compressed quality, the light thin and brief at either end and the darkness in between absolute. She had been at Iron Ridge Ranch for 31 days when the fire started. It was past midnight. She knew this because she'd been awake. She'd woken around 11, with the particular alertness that sometimes came on her in the deep of the night, the kind that had no obvious cause and wouldn't let itself be reasoned back to sleep. She'd lain in the tack room for a while, listening to the barn and the wind, and then she'd given up on sleep and wrapped her coat around her blankets and sat up and let her mind move. She was thinking about her mother's recipes. She did this sometimes, not from sentiment exactly, but as a kind of planning, the way a craftsman thinks through their materials. Her mother had kept the recipes in a small green book that had water damage on the bottom corner, and Clara could see the handwriting clearly when she thought about it, the cramped, careful letters of a woman who'd learned to write as an adult and treated every word like it cost something. She was thinking about a recipe for a particular kind of bread, something with molasses and cornmeal, that she'd been meaning to try since she'd found the sorghum jar in the cookhouse supplies when she smelled it. She smelled it before she understood what it was. Her body registered it before her mind did, something that made her sit up straighter and pull the blankets off and stand up in the dark of the tack room, all in one continuous motion, driven by something older than thought. Smoke, not the good kind, not wood smoke from a stove or hearth. She'd been sleeping near that smell for a month and knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. This was different, harsher. the specific chemical sharpness of something structural burning, wood that wasn't meant to burn burning. She was at the tack room door with her boots in her hand before the thought finished forming. She got the latch up, shoved the door open, and the cold hit her. And then the other thing hit her, visible now, not just a smell. A line of orange light at the base of the cookhouse, across the yard, too bright for the hour, too bright for any innocent source. The cookhouse was on fire. Clara stood for exactly 1 second processing. She thought about the flour sacks, the lard bucket, the oil for the lamps, all of it together, and the fire between her and all of it, and the distance across the yard, and how far the fire had already gone. She started running. She wasn't thinking clearly. She'd want to say this later, in the way people excuse themselves from the decisions they make in crisis, except that it wasn't entirely true either. Part of her was thinking, was cataloging what was inside that she needed, what couldn't be replaced, the green recipe book she didn't have but was always thinking about, which meant she was really thinking about herself, about the things she'd lost that still lived in her head. But some part of her was also thinking, clearly and practically, the fire was at the base of the south wall, not the door. And if she went through the door fast enough, she was halfway across the yard when something hit her from the side. Not hard. It wasn't a blow. It was a body, a person moving fast and intersecting her path, and she spun and almost went down on the ice and caught herself. And Rowan was there. He'd come from somewhere. The direction of the bunkhouse, she thought, which meant he'd seen it first or smelled it first or heard something. And he had his coat on, but not his hat, and his expression when he looked at her was the clearest she'd ever seen it, stripped of the usual private reserve, nothing complicated left in it. "Don't," he said. Just the one word. "My things are in there," she said. She heard how it sounded. She didn't care. "What things?" His hands were on her arms, not gripping, just placed, anchoring. There's nothing that can't." She stopped. She looked at the cookhouse, at the line of fire along the south wall that had grown in the 60 seconds since she'd first seen it, and she did the honest accounting. Her spare dress, her extra pair of socks, the list she'd been keeping of suppliers Hatch should know about, a folded piece of paper with her mother's molasses bread recipe that she'd written out from memory 3 weeks ago when she'd had a quiet evening, because she'd been afraid of losing it from her mind. None of it was worth what the fire would cost her. "Nothing," she said. She took a step back from him. "Nothing I can't lose." Behind them, the bunkhouse was waking up. She could hear it, voices, the sound of boots, Hatch's voice carrying authority across the cold. The ranch was coming alive around the fire the way ranches did, organized and fast, because fire was the one enemy that required everyone and hesitated for nothing. Rowan looked at her face for another second, making sure of something, and then he turned and went toward the water trough, and Clara went with him, and the next hour was the particular chaos of managed crisis. They lost the south wall and part of the roof. They saved the rest. Callum organized the bucket line with the efficiency of a man who'd fought range fires before, which it turned out he had. Hatch directed the effort to wet down the barn and the nearest structure with calm, practical authority. The younger hands, Dell, Marcus, others, worked without being asked twice, passing buckets and pulling back when the heat required it and going back in when it didn't. Rowan was at the front of it. He was always at the front of it, closer to the fire than was strictly sensible, working with a focused urgency that she watched from her place in the bucket line and filed away as another thing she didn't fully understand about him. By the time the fire was out, not doused exactly, more defeated, beaten back to smoldering at the ruined wall with the cold night air finishing what the water had started. The sky had the first blue-gray suggestion of dawn in the east, and everyone was wet and exhausted and smelled of smoke. Clara stood at the edge of the yard and looked at what was left. The cookhouse was standing mostly. The door in the north wall and the stove were intact. The south wall was a ruin of charred timber and the roof above it had gone. Whatever had been stored on the south side, she'd think about the inventory later, she wasn't ready yet, was gone. Hatch came to stand beside her. He looked at the damage with an expression that was tired and calculating in equal measure. "Stove's all right," Clara said, because that was what mattered practically. "Stove's all right," Hatch confirmed. "We'll get the wall patched before the week's out. Roof will take longer." He paused. "What started it?" Clara shook her head. I don't know. I was in the tack room. I smelled it and came out. Lantern left burning? I bank them before I leave every night, she said. I've been careful. Hatch nodded. She couldn't tell if he believed her entirely or was reserving judgment. She didn't have the energy to push on it. She went to look at what could be salvaged. I'll try 'em. It was mid-morning before things settled enough for the ranch to begin resembling its regular self. And by then Clara had cataloged the losses, identified what was intact, started organizing the cookhouse around the surviving half of its structure, and stood over the ruined south wall for 10 minutes saying nothing to the frozen air. The molasses bread recipe was gone. The paper she'd written it on had been in a tin on the south shelf, which was now part of the debris. She could reconstruct it from memory. She knew she could. She stood there and told herself she could, and felt the loss of it anyway, irrational and complete. Clara. She turned. Rowan was standing at what had been the cookhouse door, now propped open because the frame had warped slightly in the heat. He looked like she felt, worn through, eyes red from smoke, a long night sitting on his face. There's coffee, he said, in the bunkhouse. I know where the coffee is. I mean, there's coffee someone else made, he said. Come drink it. She looked at him. The morning light was coming in flat and white across the snow, the kind that showed everything in detail, no shadow to soften it. He had ash on his jaw, and his left hand was wrapped in a cloth. She hadn't noticed it in the chaos, and now it stopped her. Your hand, she said. He looked down at it. It's fine. Let me see it. Clara, let me see it, she said again. He came over to where she stood and held out the hand, and she unwrapped the cloth and looked at what was underneath. The burn was along the top of his hand and part way up the wrist. Not the old scarring she'd been aware of for weeks, but new damage, raw and red, with 2 places on the knuckles that had blistered already. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked up at him. How did you get this? He was quiet for a moment. There was a support beam on the south wall, he said. When it started to go, it had to come down or it would have taken more of the roof. I got there before Callum did. She looked at the burn again, then at his face. You should have woken the bunkhouse first. There wasn't time for both. She let go of his hand carefully and rewrapped the cloth, not looking at him. This needs proper dressing, she said. I have what I need in the tack room. Come with me. He followed her without arguing, which told her the hand hurt more than he was saying. She sat him down on the crate in the tack room and got her small kit from the shelf. She'd been carrying the same tin for 2 years, cloth and a little salve and a roll of bandaging she replaced when she could. And she dressed his hand properly with the focus of someone who needed a task to keep from feeling the morning all at once. He let her work. He was still in that stripped-down way he'd been in during the fire, none of the usual privacy in his face. He watched her hands while she worked. There's something I need to tell you, he said. She kept her attention on the bandage. You said that before, about a month ago. I know. A pause. I've been working up to it. For a month. It's not a simple thing to say. She tied off the bandage and sat back and looked at him. The cold morning light came through the single small window of the tack room and lay across the floor between them. Outside, the ranch was making its regular sounds. Cattle, a door somewhere, one of the men calling to another. Say it, she said. Rowan looked at his bandaged hand. Then he looked at her. I own this ranch, he said. Clara looked at him. Not Hatch, he said. Hatch runs it. He has for 8 years, and he's better at it than I'd be, which is why the arrangement works. But the deed has my name on it. My father built it. He died 4 years ago and left it to me. And I came back for the funeral, and I looked at the place, and I realized I didn't know a single thing about it, about how it worked, about what made it run, about the men who'd put the years in. He paused. I'd been east. School, then working in an office, learning the finance side of things from my father's partners, being prepared to be someone who owned land without knowing what land actually was. Clara said nothing. I asked Hatch to let me work, Rowan said. He thought I was half out of my mind. I told him I'd explain it to the men however he wanted to, but that what I wanted, what I needed, was to learn it the way you learn a thing when you can't fall back on being the owner, when you have to actually be worth something. He turned the bandaged hand slowly. I've been here 2 years. Most of the men don't know. Hatch knows. Callum's figured it out and hasn't said anything because Callum is Callum. Clara kept her eyes on his face. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Her voice was very even. "Because of the other thing," he said. "The thing that's been making this hard to say." She waited. He looked at her directly now. 6 years ago, he said. I was in Billings. I was 23. I was in the Monarch, so not the way Pete implies, just in the bar portion of it. I'd been there 3 times. It was the best food in that part of town, and the back dining room was decent. He stopped. He breathed out through his nose. There was a woman there, working in the kitchen, but she came out sometimes to help with the tables when it was busy. The cook's daughter, people said. Clara's hands went very still in her lap. There was a man, Rowan said, a regular. He'd been drinking, and he was the kind of man who gets uglier as the evening goes on. He said something to her, out loud, at the table, in front of the room, about her, about what he thought she was, what he thought her presence in a place like that meant. He paused. It was vicious. It was deliberately vicious. He wanted her to hear it, and he wanted everyone else in the room to hear it, and she did, and everyone else did, and the room went quiet. In that particular way, a room goes quiet when something awful happens, and no one knows whether to speak or just let it pass. Clara looked at the wall behind him. I didn't say anything, Rowan said. I was 23, and I didn't want the trouble. And I told myself it wasn't my place, and I looked down at my plate. I heard her walk back through the kitchen door, and I heard the door swing shut behind her, and I sat there and I finished my meal. His voice was steady, but the evenness of it was deliberate. I left before the evening was done. I put it out of my mind because I was good at that then. I left Billings 2 weeks later for a job my father's partner had for me in Denver, and I didn't think about it for almost a year. He stopped talking. Clara was very still. You didn't recognize me when I got here, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. I recognized you the moment you walked through that door, he said. The second you walked in out of the storm and asked for the man who ran the place. I knew your face. I've known your face for 6 years. She sat with that. Outside, someone was chopping wood. The regular sound of it came in through the walls, steady, methodical, indifferent to what was happening in the small, cold room. You've known who I was, she said, this whole time. Yes. And you didn't say anything. No, he said, because anything I said in the first day or the first week would have sounded like what it wasn't, like I was trying to manage it, like I was trying to get ahead of you figuring it out on your own. He looked at the floor, and because I didn't know how to say it, I still barely know. Clara stood up. She moved to the wall and stood with her back to it, and looked at him sitting on the crate with his bandaged hand and his ash-smudged face and the full weight of 6 years in his eyes. You watched it happen, she said. Yes. And you did nothing. Yes. She thought about being 20 years old in a bar dining room in Billings, Montana, bringing water to a table, and the man's voice carrying the way it had, designed to carry, designed for maximum audience, and the way the room had gone silent and stayed silent while she walked back through the kitchen door. She remembered the sound of that silence. She'd carried it a long time. She'd assumed, the way you assume when you're the one who was humiliated, that everyone in that room was the same, that they'd all heard and none of them had objected, and there was no meaningful difference between a man who'd said it and a man who'd sat there and let it sit. And she'd been right. She'd been right about that room that night, including about Rowan Hale. I know what I did, he said. I know it doesn't go away because I feel bad about it. I know I've spent 2 years trying to... He stopped, started again. I'm not telling you this because I want something from you. I'm not telling you because I think a confession means you owe me anything. I'm telling you because you deserve to know, and because keeping it from you while I stood in your kitchen and fixed your porch step and pretended I was just being a decent person. He shook his head. That was its own kind of lie. You deserve better than that. Clara looked at him for a long time. The anger was there. She'd be lying to herself if she said it wasn't. It moved through her slow and cold and real, not the sharp kind that passes quickly, but the settling kind, the kind that finds the foundation of things and sits there. She'd been carrying that room in Billings for 6 years, and he'd been in it, and he'd been part of what she'd carried. And knowing that he'd recognized her and said nothing about it for the entire month she'd been here, While she struggled and cooked and fought Pete Dunmore's stories and managed the isolation, that added weight to the old weight, and she felt it. She also saw clearly the thing his face was doing. Not the false guilt of a man performing remorse for an audience. She'd seen enough of that to know the difference. What she saw was something harder. The expression of a person who has looked at themselves honestly and found something they don't like and is still looking, because not looking is worse. "Why the fire?" she said. "Why now?" He shook his head. "The fire has nothing to do with it. I was going to tell you this week regardless. I've been telling myself I'd say it since December." He looked at his hand. "The fire just—" He paused. "When I saw you running toward it. When I grabbed you and you said, 'My things are in there.'" He stopped. "I needed you to know who I was before something happened that meant I never got to say it." Clara looked at the window. The flat white winter light, the frost on the glass. "You need to let me think," she said. "I know," he said. "This isn't a thing I can just—" She stopped herself. "I need time." "You have it," he said. "Whatever you need. I'm not going anywhere." A pause. "Unless you want me to, in which case I'll—" "You're not leaving your own ranch," Clara said. Something moved in his face, a small involuntary thing, almost like relief, which struck her as premature, but she understood it. He'd said the thing. It was out now, and whatever happened to it was out of his hands. He stood up carefully, favoring the bandaged hand. He moved toward the door. She watched him get there. "Rowan," she said. He stopped. "The man in the Monarch," she said. "The one who said it." "Yes." "Did you know him? Were you friendly with him?" Rowan shook his head. "I didn't know him. He was a regular there. I'd seen him before, but we'd never spoken." He paused. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not." "No," Clara said. "I know. I'm just—" She looked at the floor. "I spent a long time thinking everyone in that room was the same. I built something around that." She looked up. "I'm trying to figure out whether it holds." He looked at her. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say, and he seemed to understand that. He left. Clara sat down on the crate he'd vacated. It was still warm. She sat with her hands in her lap and the cold coming through the walls and the sounds of the ranch outside, and she thought about 6 years and a room in Billings and the particular shape of the silence that had followed her since. She'd told herself a story about that night. The story was simple. She'd been humiliated. The room had watched. No one had helped. The story was true. It would remain true regardless of whatever she decided about Rowan Hale. What she was working through now was the more complicated question of whether the story could be large enough to hold something new inside it. Whether truth, once you'd been living in it for 6 years, had room to grow without ceasing to be itself. She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure she was ready to look for one. But she sat there in the cold little room and turned it over. And outside, the sun moved across the white ground, and the ranch went about its business, and time kept passing the way it does, which is without waiting for you to be ready. She went back to the cookhouse in the early afternoon and assessed the damage with practical eyes. The surviving half was workable. The stove was intact. She built the fire and got it going, and stood in the smoke smell of the ruined portion and made a list of what she had and what she needed, and she gave the list to Hatch at 2 o'clock, and he read it without comment and said he'd send someone to Ridgeback in the morning. "You don't have to sleep in the tack room," Hatch said. "There's a spare bunk in—" "I'm fine in the tack room," Clara said. He looked at her once, direct, reading something in her face. "All right," he said. He moved to leave. "Rowan tell you?" She met his eyes. "Yes." Hatch nodded, very slow, the way he nodded when something was exactly what he'd expected. "Been waiting for him to do that since December," he said. "Surprised he lasted this long." "Did you know I was the woman from Billings?" she asked. "When I came here." "No," Hatch said. "He told me about it last week, said he was going to tell you, and he wanted me to know first." He paused. "He's been carrying that for a long time, for what it's worth." "I know," Clara said. Hatch left. She stood in the half-ruined cookhouse and got started on supper with what she had. She didn't see Rowan at supper. She noticed his absence in the way you notice the absence of something that's been a constant. She didn't ask anyone about it. He appeared that evening when the dishes were nearly done, coming in quietly, not in his usual way, but with a deliberateness that said he'd decided to come and then had to make himself follow through. He stood at the door. She was at the wash basin. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "How's the hand?" she asked. "Stiff," he said. "It'll be all right." She nodded. She dried her hands on the cloth and turned to face him, and they stood in the low lamplight of the half-ruined cookhouse with the smell of smoke and supper and the cold coming through the gap in the south wall. "I'm not ready to have the bigger conversation," she said. "I need you to understand that." "I do," he said. "I'm not saying never," she said. "I'm saying not yet." She looked at him carefully. "What you told me today, I believe it. I believe that it's true, and I believe that you meant to say it. That doesn't mean I know what to do with it." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it." "I know you're not," she said. "That's part of what's making it hard." He stood there with his bandaged hand at his side and his face open in that new way the fire had left it. And she stood across from him, and they occupied the same cold room, and the distance between them was some amount that she couldn't measure with any unit she had. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you did last night. For the beam. It needed to come down. You know that's not what I mean." He held her eyes. He knew. She turned back to finish the washing, and he stayed in the doorway for another moment and then left, and she stood at the basin and let the evening settle around her and tried to sort out what she was feeling, which was too many things at once to separate clearly. Anger, still. Old and new both, layered. Something else, newer and less comfortable. The specific kind of disquiet that comes from having the story you've been living in complicated by a detail you didn't put there. And underneath both of those, something she didn't want to look at directly yet. The recognition that Rowan Hale, who had watched her be humiliated in a billing saloon and done nothing, had spent 2 years becoming someone who would charge toward a burning wall to pull a beam down before it took the roof. And that those two things were true about the same person, and that making sense of how they lived in the same person was going to require more of her than she'd anticipated needing to give. She finished the dishes. She banked the fire. She walked through the cold to the tack room and latched the door. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. She could feel it in the quality of the air. The clean, absolute cold of a Montana night in January. The kind that didn't ask permission and didn't apologize. She pulled the blankets up and lay in the dark and didn't sleep for a long time, thinking about fire and truth and the particular cost of becoming someone worth trusting after you've already proven that you're not. She thought about what it would mean to forgive a thing that hadn't been done to you personally, that had been done near you, around you, through the collective failure of every person in a room to be better than the worst person in it. She thought about what she would have done at 23, in a room where something ugly was happening, and the cost of objecting was the discomfort of a stranger. She lay in the dark, and she didn't have a clean answer, and she didn't look for one, and the night deepened around her, and eventually, somewhere past 2 in the morning, she slept. She didn't decide to leave all at once. It was more like the decision assembled itself over several days, quietly, the way ice forms on a still pond. Not dramatic, not a single moment, just a gradual solidifying of something that had been liquid and uncertain, until one morning it was simply there, and she could see it clearly, and she understood it had probably been forming for longer than she'd noticed. In the days following the fire and Rowan's confession, the cookhouse was rebuilt around her in pieces. Callum organized the timber work with the same flat efficiency he brought to everything. 2 of the younger hands proved surprisingly capable with a hammer, and were put to use on the south wall while Clara worked around them, accommodating the noise and the cold drafts and the sawdust that got into everything. The roof patch went up rough but solid, new planks pale against the darkened older wood. Within 4 days, the cookhouse was functional again, if not restored. She kept cooking. She kept the fire going. She kept her face composed and her work excellent and her internal life entirely private, which was not new. She'd been doing all 3 since long before Iron Ridge, but which cost her more now than it had before because there was more to keep private. The situation with Rowan had changed the quality of the air between them without either of them naming it. He was still present, still reliable in the ways he'd always been reliable, still appearing when something needed doing and disappearing when it didn't. But there was a new self-consciousness in how he moved around her, a carefulness she recognized as the behavior of a man trying not to ask for something he understood she hadn't offered. He didn't push, He didn't try to continue the conversation she'd told him she wasn't ready to have. She appreciated it and found it simultaneously exhausting, because the truth was that she was thinking about it constantly. It occupied the back of her mind through every meal she cooked, every early morning when the fire was new and the cookhouse was cold and the day hadn't started weighing on her yet. She would be skimming fat off a pot of broth and find herself back in the tack room with Rowan's bandaged hand in her lap, and his voice saying, "I recognized you the moment you walked through that door," and she'd have to set the spoon down and breathe through it before she could go on. She'd been wronged. She was clear on that. The wrong wasn't enormous by the scale of the world's wrongs. No one had hurt her physically. No one had stolen from her. No one had done anything that the law would recognize. What had happened was a room full of people watching a woman be degraded and doing nothing, and the weight of that nothing had followed her for 6 years. And learning that one of those watching people was now the man who fixed her porch step and sorted her beans and pulled a burning beam down from a roof, that created a knot in her chest that she couldn't seem to work loose. She tried to be honest with herself about what she actually felt, which was harder than it sounded because feelings of this kind had a tendency to dress up as simpler things. She was angry. That was real, and she wasn't going to argue herself out of it. She was also, beneath the anger, something more complicated, something that had to do with the way Rowan had said, "I know what I did," without qualifying it, without building himself a defense, without offering the extenuations that men usually offered when they were trying to reduce the size of their failures. He'd said it plain, and he'd held still for it, and it was hard to know what to do with that, when the anger wanted something to push against and he refused to push back. What she kept coming back to in the early mornings with the fire new and the light coming slow through the small window was a question she didn't want to ask but couldn't stop asking. What did she actually want from this? Apology, she had. Explanation, she had. Accountability, plainly offered without negotiation. She'd never gotten any of those things from the man who'd actually said the words in The Monarch, and she never would, and she'd made her peace with that in the particular way you make peace with things that can't be fixed. Not by resolving them, but by building a life that was larger than they were. What Rowan had given her was something she hadn't known to want, which was a witness. Someone who had been in that room saying, "I was there, I know it happened, it was wrong, and I'm sorry." She had not understood until he said it how much she'd needed someone to say it. And yet, she lay in the tack room on the 5th night after the fire and stared at the ceiling and was honest with herself. What she was afraid of was exactly this. That she needed something from him, that the fact of his having been there, and his regret, and the slow, quiet decency she'd been watching him practice for 6 weeks, had made him matter in a way that made her vulnerable in a way she could not afford. She'd built something very careful over the years. She'd built it out of self-sufficiency and clear eyes, and the understanding that the only person she could wholly rely on was herself. She'd built it after the Monarch and after Billings, and after the family in the East that had decided they didn't need her anymore, and after all of it, the accumulated weight of being a woman alone on the frontier who had to earn her place in every room she entered. That structure was what she had. It had kept her walking for 11 miles through a December blizzard. It had kept her face right when Pete's stories were turning the room against her. It had kept her standing at the basin washing dishes after Rowan said the thing he'd been carrying for 6 years. She was afraid that if she let herself need something from Rowan Hale, it would change the load-bearing qualities of what she'd built, and she couldn't afford for it to fail. By the 7th day after the fire, she'd started to understand that she was going to leave. She didn't say anything about it. She kept to her work, kept to her routines, kept feeding the men their meals and maintaining the cookhouse and behaving exactly as she had for the past 6 weeks, because she understood that she owed Hatch the work she'd contracted for, and she wasn't going to leave it half done. But she started keeping track of what she had. Her savings, small but real. Hatch paid reliably, and she'd spent almost nothing, there being almost nothing to spend it on. The state of her clothing, what she'd need for the road. She thought about where she'd go. Not back east. She'd spent enough time going back east, and it always went the same way, which was that the East had a longer memory than the West, and more ways of making a woman feel it. Further west, then. There were cattle trail stops coming up through the spring, places where travelers moved through and needed feeding, and the right kind of establishment could make a life for a person who was willing to work. She thought about her mother's recipes, the ones in her head which hadn't burned, the molasses bread reconstructed from memory. the apple pie, the bean soup she'd made the first night, which had been good enough that Callum had eaten 3 bowls. She thought about what it would mean to cook not for someone else's ranch, but for her own table, in her own space, with her own name over the door. It was a large thought. She didn't let herself want it too directly yet, the way you don't let yourself want something that requires too much to happen first. But she turned it over and kept it. She told Hatch on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the fire. He was at the table with his coffee and his account ledger, doing the thing he did every Thursday, which was adding up the week's numbers with the expression of a man who finds the numbers acceptable but would prefer them to be better. She sat down across from him without being invited, which was something she'd learned she could do with Hatch. He respected directness in proportion to how directly it was offered. "I'm leaving at the end of the month," she said. Hatch looked up from the ledger. He looked at her for a moment. He didn't look surprised, which told her he was better at reading people than he usually let on. "End of January," he said. "Yes. That's 3 weeks. I'll train whoever you hire. I'll write out recipes, instructions, inventory lists. I'll leave you in better shape than I found you." Hatch was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup. "You want more money?" he said, not as an accusation, just trying to understand the shape of the problem. "No," she said. "The money's fair." "Then what is it?" She looked at him. "It's time," she said. "I've been here long enough to know it's time to do something different." He studied her. He was a man who had run a ranch for long enough to understand that sometimes people left, and sometimes the reason was the kind that couldn't be fixed with more money or better conditions, and that pushing on it only made everyone feel worse. "Rowan," he said. Not a question. "Partly," Clara said. "Not the way you might think. He did the right thing, telling me what he told me. It's not that." She paused, trying to find the honest version. "It's more that being here, now, with all of it, I can't think clearly, and I need to think clearly about what I want and where I'm going and who I'm building a life with, which right now is myself, and that's fine, but I can't figure it out while I'm standing in his cookhouse." Hatch nodded, slow. "His cookhouse," he repeated. "You know what I mean?" "I do." He closed the ledger. "End of January, then. I'll pay your contract through February as agreed." Clara shook her head. "That's not necessary." "I said I would," Hatch said. "That means I will." He picked up his coffee. "Where are you going?" "West," she said. "There's a cattle trail stop about 40 miles out, place called Dennard's Crossing. I've heard it's got a building that used to be a restaurant and the owner's looking to rent space." "You heard that from who?" "Callum," she said. "He mentioned it in passing 3 weeks ago. I filed it." Hatch almost smiled, in the way he almost smiled. "You file a lot." "It's useful," she said. He looked at her for another moment, the measuring look, the one that meant he was seeing something he respected even if he wasn't going to make a speech about it. "You'll do all right," he said, "whatever you land on." It wasn't much as farewells went. Coming from Hatch, it was considerable. She told no one else. She went about her days. The dynamics of the bunkhouse had shifted again in the weeks since the fire. Shifted in the way that shared crises tend to shift group dynamics, which is not always toward the better, but always toward something more honest. Pete Dunmore had been conspicuously present during the firefighting, working the bucket line without complaint. And in the aftermath, he'd been quieter in the general way. People get quiet when an event has made their previous behavior look small by contrast. He didn't apologize to Clara. She didn't expect him to. But the edge he'd been putting on every interaction with her had dulled, and she found she could move through the cookhouse with less of the specific wariness she'd been carrying, which was a relief she tried not to be too grateful for. Abe continued to be Abe. Dell and Marcus had returned to something closer to their original ease, with the residual self-consciousness of young men who knew they'd behaved badly and weren't sure how to cover the distance back. Callum remained Callum, which was to say, fixed, reliable, a little like a fence post in a gale. Rowan she saw every day, because Iron Ridge was not large enough to miss seeing someone every day, and because he continued to work it the way he'd been working it, fully, carefully, without calling attention to himself. But the thing between them had changed. There was a new quality to how they occupied the same spaces, more charged, somehow, now that she knew what she knew, and simultaneously more careful on both sides, like two people who'd realized they were standing near something fragile and were trying not to be the one who broke it. He didn't try to resume the conversation she'd asked him to leave. He respected that in a way that was both easier and harder than she'd anticipated. Easier because she didn't have to manage it. Harder because his restraint made it difficult to sustain the simpler version of her anger, the version that didn't require her to see him clearly. On the 14th day after the fire, a Sunday, her day off, she walked out along the fence line east of the main buildings, the way she sometimes did when the weather was bearable and she needed to be outside the walls for a while. It was cold, but still, the sky flat and white above the ridges, the snow hard and crusted over so it didn't pull at her boots. She walked for maybe 20 minutes and then stopped and stood and looked at the country. She heard him coming. She didn't turn around. He came up beside her and stood at a polite distance and looked at the same thing she was looking at, which was mostly just the long, flat white of the valley and the dark line of the tree-covered ridge beyond it. "You're leaving," he said. She glanced at him. "Hatch tell you?" "No." He paused. "I can see it." She looked back at the valley. End of the month. He nodded, once. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled low against the white glare, and he was looking at the ridge with an expression she couldn't read from the side. "All right," he said. She'd expected more than that. She wasn't sure what. Some attempt to change her mind, some argument, some version of the conversation she'd told him she wasn't ready for. What she got was 2 words and the sound of his breathing in the cold air. "That's all?" she said. He turned to look at her. "What would you like me to say?" "I don't know," she said, honestly. "Something. I could tell you to stay," he said. "I could make an argument for it. I could tell you that what I've been trying to build here, the thing I've been trying to become for the past 2 years, for reasons that have more to do with you than I'd understood until you walked through that door, that it matters, that I'm not the man who sat at that table in Billings anymore, and I can prove it if you give me time." He looked at her steadily. "I could say all of that, and it would all be true." Clara held his eyes. "But if you need to go," he said, "then you need to go. I don't have any claim on what you do, and I'm not going to make leaving harder than it already is just because it's hard for me." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the snow between them, lifting a small ghost of it that drifted and settled. "Why is it hard for you?" she asked. The question came out more direct than she'd planned. Rowan looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the tack room on the morning of the fire. Stripped down, nothing hidden. "Because I've spent 2 years trying to be someone worth knowing," he said, "and the only person I've needed to know it was you, and you're leaving before I've finished." Clara stood in the cold and felt that land. She didn't move it out of the way or make it smaller. She just stood there and felt it. "I need to do this myself," she said. "Whatever comes next, I need to do it without someone else's story wrapped around it. Without being the woman in your cookhouse. Without being the woman Pete Dunmore told stories about. Without being the woman from the Monarch. I need to find out what I am when I'm none of those things." "I know," he said. "I know that. I don't know if there's room for someone else in that," she said. "I don't know what it looks like on the other side of it. I can't promise you—" "I'm not asking you to promise anything," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything." He breathed out slowly. "I just want you to know what's true, about where I stand. You can do whatever you want with that." She looked at the ridge. She looked at the white country. She thought about 40 miles west and a building that had once been a restaurant and the particular weight of a fresh start when you've carried old weight long enough that you've stopped noticing how heavy it is. "I need to get back," she said. "All right," he said. She started walking. She walked 6 paces and stopped and turned back. "What you told me," she said, "in the tack room. I want you to know I've thought about it every day since." He stood still. He didn't say anything. "That doesn't mean I know what to do with it," she said. "I'm still not there. But I wanted you to know I heard it, all of it." He nodded. His jaw was doing the controlled thing, holding something in. "Go make lunch," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges in a way it usually wasn't. "Before Callum comes looking for you." She almost smiled. She turned and walked back toward the cookhouse, and she didn't look back again, and she heard him stay where he was on the frozen ground behind her, and the distance between them grew until she couldn't hear him breathing anymore. The last 10 days at Iron Ridge passed with a particular quality she'd noticed before in endings, a heightened noticing, the way you start to see a place more clearly once you've decided to leave it. The dark timber of the bunkhouse, the sound the cattle made in the early morning, the specific way the stove in the cookhouse needed to be coaxed. She made note of all of it without sentimentalizing it, because she wasn't built for that kind of sentimentality, but she noted it. She wrote out the recipes. 7 pages of them, in her careful hand, with notes about quantities and timing and the particular temperament of the stove. She wrote out the inventory system she'd developed, the supplier list, the notes on which cuts of meat held up better through the week and which needed to be used fresh. She put it all together and left it on the work table for whoever came next. She trained Dell, of all people, who'd expressed a tentative interest in cooking and whose interest she thought was genuine, even if his skill was not yet equal to it. She spent 4 of the last evenings showing him the basics: knife work, how to build a roux, how to tell when bread was done by sound and feel rather than just time. He was a poor student in the way of people who don't have natural aptitude, but he had genuine attention, which you could work with. She told him so, and he looked slightly stunned to be told anything direct and positive, which told her something about the general atmosphere of feedback at Iron Ridge that she decided not to examine too closely. She talked to Abe the day before she left. Not a long conversation. Neither of them were long conversation people, but a real one. He'd come by the cookhouse in the late afternoon on a pretext she recognized as a pretext, and she'd poured him coffee and they'd stood in the warm space of the kitchen while the cold sat outside the walls, and he'd said, looking at his cup, "You did good work here." "Thank you, Abe." "Better than the work," he said. "The rest of it, too. Carrying yourself right under circumstances that weren't easy." She looked at him. He wasn't a man who gave out words like that. Each one cost something. "I appreciate that," she said, and meant it more than she said it. He nodded, drank his coffee, and left. That was the whole of it. She talked to Callum, too, briefly, about Dennard's Crossing. She wanted to verify what she'd heard, get his read on the place and the owner, and whether her plan held any water. He confirmed what she remembered. The building was real. The owner was a man named Ott, who'd bought it on speculation and hadn't done much with it. The cattle trail traffic was genuine enough to support a proper eating establishment if someone ran it right. "You'll need capital," Callum said. "For supplies, at minimum." "I have some," Clara said. "Ott'll want rent up front." "I know." Callum looked at her with his sun-dried apple expression. "You've thought this through." "I've been thinking about it for a while," she said. He nodded. "You'll be all right," he said, which was almost word for word what Hatch had said, and coming from Callum meant something similar. Not comfort exactly, more like assessment, a statement of observed probability. She left on a Tuesday. January 28th before sunrise. She'd arranged a ride with a supply wagon heading west through Ridgeback, which was on the way to Dennard's Crossing, and the driver, a man named Gus she'd met through the trading post connection, was leaving at first light and had agreed to take her and her bag for the cost of a pie, which she'd made the day before, and which was, she felt, an equitable exchange. She packed the night before. It didn't take long. There wasn't much more than there'd been when she arrived. The satchel, clothes, her tin kit, the small amount of money wrapped in a cloth inside the satchel's inner pocket. What was different was the 7 pages of recipes in her coat pocket and the rebuilt version of her mother's molasses bread formula, written out in her hand on a fresh piece of paper that Hatch had given her from his account book without asking why she needed it. She built the fire in the cookhouse one last time before she left. She did it by feel in the dark, the way she'd done it every morning for 47 days, and she stood for a moment after it caught and listened to it find itself. Then she shouldered her bag and went out into the cold. The ranch was still dark. The sky in the east had only the earliest suggestion of gray. Her breath made clouds in the air. The snow under her boots was the particular crunch of deep cold, maybe 15 below, the kind of cold that meant business. She was halfway across the yard when she heard the cookhouse door she'd left open make a sound behind her, and she stopped. She didn't turn around right away. She stood with her bag on her shoulder and her breath in clouds, and the cold absolute around her, and she made herself breathe twice before she turned. Rowan was standing in the cookhouse doorway. He had his coat on and his hat on and his bandaged hand at his side, the white cloth visible in the pre-dawn dark. He'd gotten the bandage redone 2 days ago. She'd done it herself because the original had worn through and he hadn't asked anyone else, which she'd noticed and not commented on. They looked at each other across the yard. "You didn't have to get up," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The dark was still heavy enough that she couldn't read his expression clearly, just the shape of him in the doorway, the familiar set of his shoulders, the hat. She didn't know what to say. She'd said most of what she had to say on the fence line 10 days ago, and he'd said most of what he had to say, and what was left between them was something that hadn't been resolved and wasn't going to be this morning, not in the dark and the cold, with a supply wagon waiting on the road. "Take care of the stove," she said. "It needs to be started from the right side or it smokes." "I know how to start the stove," he said. "I know you do." She shifted her bag. "Dell needs watching. He's got the interest, but his timing is off. Someone should—" "Clara." She stopped. He came off the porch and crossed the yard toward her, not fast, just walking, and he stopped at a distance that was close but not presumptuous, and he reached into his coat and brought out an envelope and held it out. She took it. She looked at it. It had her name on the front in handwriting she hadn't seen before but recognized immediately as his. Cramped, left-leaning, the hand of someone who'd learned to write and treated it like another kind of work. "Don't read it here," he said. "Read it when you're settled, or don't read it at all. That's your right, too." She put it in her coat pocket beside the recipe pages. "Rowan," she said. "What?" She looked at him in the gray pre-dawn light of an Iron Ridge morning, at his burned hand and his composed face, and the 2 years of becoming someone worth knowing that were written in the way he stood, and she thought about all of it, the monarch, the fire, the beans sorted on the work table, the porch step fixed without being asked, and she thought about what she'd said on the fence line. "I need to find out what I am when I'm none of those things." She still needed that. She still believed it. "I'm glad you told me," she said. "What you told me in the tack room. I want you to know that, even if it doesn't look like it right now." He held her eyes. "It looks like it," he said quietly. She didn't have anything else. She turned and walked toward the road. She got to the gate and pushed it open and stopped once, briefly, not turning all the way around, just a pause in her walking, a breath in the cold. She could feel him still standing there in the yard. Then she went through the gate and pulled it closed behind her, and she walked out to where Gus's wagon was waiting on the frozen road, its horses stamping in the cold. And she climbed up onto the bench and put her bag between her feet, and Gus said, "Morning," and she said morning back, and he clicked at the horses and they started moving. She watched Iron Ridge fall behind them as the road curved. The buildings went gray in the early light, then smaller, then gone around the bend. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the envelope there, and the recipe pages next to it, and she kept her hand on both of them and watched the road unreal ahead in the cold gray morning. She didn't open the envelope. Not yet. She thought about Dennard's Crossing. She thought about a building that had once been a restaurant. She thought about her mother's recipes and the 7 pages she'd written out, and what it might mean to put her own name over a door. The wagon moved west. The cold was real and absolute. The sky lightened by degrees, slow and steady, the way the sky has always lightened, without drama, without announcement. Just the dark becoming gradually less dark until you couldn't say exactly when it had become morning. Clara sat on the bench with her hand in her pocket and her face toward the road and did not let herself look back again. She was good at that, at not looking back. She'd had a lot of practice, but she was aware, in the particular way you're aware of things you're trying not to feel too directly, that leaving and being done were not the same thing. That the envelope in her pocket was going to require something of her eventually. That the question of who she was when she was none of those things, not Pete's story, not Rowan's guilt, not the woman from the Monarch, was a question she was going to have to answer alone first, in a place that was her own, before she'd know whether the answer left room for anything else. She'd left hard things before and come through them. She'd come through them by being honest with herself about what they cost and not pretending the cost was less than it was. This one was going to cost something. She kept her hand on the envelope and watched the road and let the cold morning move around her and did not look back and did not pretend it was easy. and the horses moved, and the distance grew, and the ranch behind her settled into the past like everything else she'd carried out of. Ahead, the sky went pale gold at the horizon's edge. Not warm yet, just the suggestion of it, the color that comes before the heat, the promise that dawn makes and sometimes keeps. She watched it come and kept moving toward it. She read the letter on her third night in Dennard's Crossing. Not the first night, because the first night she was too tired and too wired and too full of the practical chaos of arriving somewhere new to sit still long enough to read anything. She'd spent the afternoon in the building on the main trail that Ott rented her. A single large room that smelled of old grease and mice and abandonment, with a wood stove in the corner that needed a new flue pipe and 4 windows, 2 of which were cracked, and one of which had been repaired at some point with a piece of oilcloth that let in a cold draft and a thin gray light. She'd walked through it twice, measuring it with her eyes, making the list in her head. It was not much. It was a roof and 4 walls and a stove, and she'd started with less. The second night she was too deep in planning to stop. She had the recipe pages spread across the floor of the small room above the restaurant that Ott had included in the rental, and she was working through what she could do in the first week, what she needed to source, how much of her savings she could commit to supplies without leaving herself no margin, how long it would take to build enough regular traffic to cover the rent. The cattle trail ran through Dennard's Crossing 3 times a week in the busy season, but January was not the busy season, and she was going to have to build something out of the slow months before the spring traffic came. The third night, she was done planning. She'd done everything she could do until morning brought her access to the trading post and the possibility of credit from the owner, a broad-shouldered woman named Vera who'd looked at Clara when she arrived and asked 3 direct questions: where she'd come from, what she knew how to do, and whether she was the kind of person who quit when things got hard, and had apparently found the answers acceptable because she'd offered credit before Clara asked for it. So on the third night, she sat by the stove with the lamp turned up, and she took the envelope out of her coat pocket and looked at her name on the front of it, the cramped left-leaning handwriting, and she opened it. It was 3 pages. She hadn't expected 3 pages. She'd expected something brief, something restrained, something that matched the way he spoke, which was economical and careful. Instead, she got 3 pages in that same handwriting, dense lines that filled the paper to the edges like he'd had more to say than he'd had room for. She read it straight through without stopping. He didn't begin with an apology. He began with an account, not of the night at the Monarch, which he'd already told her, but of the year after. The job in Denver his father's partner had given him. The way he'd told himself at first that what had happened in Billings was not his responsibility, that he'd been young and the situation hadn't involved him, that the world was full of moments that happened in your vicinity without requiring your intervention. He described the architecture of that reasoning clearly, without self-pity, in a way that said he'd spent significant time examining it from the outside. He wrote about when it had broken down. Not a single dramatic moment. He was honest about that. More like an erosion. He'd been at a dinner party in Denver, about 8 months after Billings, and there'd been a woman at the table who'd been treated dismissively by the man across from her, and the table had gone quiet in that specific way, and he'd opened his mouth and said something that interrupted it, some small thing, he couldn't even remember exactly what, and the man had looked annoyed and the table had moved on, and the woman had looked at him briefly across the table and nodded once. That was all. I drove home that night, he wrote, and I thought about the room in Billings, and I understood, finally, the difference between not being the one who said the ugly thing and being someone who didn't say something back. I'd been telling myself they were the same. They aren't. She sat with that for a moment. He wrote about his father's death and the decision to come back to Iron Ridge and the choice to work it the way he'd chosen to work it, not disguised exactly, but anonymous, stripped of the inheritance that would have made every opinion he had carry weight it hadn't earned. He wrote about what he'd been trying to prove, and to whom and with what results, which he characterized, with a dryness she recognized from his voice, as mixed. And then, near the end of the second page, he wrote about her. He wrote it plainly, the way he said everything that mattered. He'd recognized her when she walked in from the storm, and the recognition had felt, to him, like something owed finally coming due. Not in a mystical sense, he was careful about that, just in the practical sense that here was the person he'd failed most directly, and here was the opportunity, if he could find the right way to use it, to be something other than who he'd been in that Billings dining room. He wrote that he understood this framing might seem like she was an instrument of his own redemption rather than a person, and that he'd been alert to that danger, and that alertness was part of why it had taken him a month to say what he needed to say. What I want you to understand, he wrote, is that what I've come to feel about you has nothing to do with the monarch or with Billings or with anything I owe you from before. What I feel is because of who you are. You walked 11 miles in December with a hole in your boot, and you made the best meal this ranch had eaten in a month, and you held your head right under conditions designed to make you do the opposite. And none of that is about me or my guilt or what I needed to fix. That's just you. That's just who you are. I wanted to make sure those two things were separate in your understanding, because they're separate in mine. She set the pages down in her lap for a moment. She looked at the lamp flame. She thought about the ways people came to know each other, how rarely it was clean, how often there was something underneath the ordinary surface of a beginning, some prior wound, some unresolved thing, some version of each other that existed before the actual people arrived. She thought about how she'd arrived at Iron Ridge already defined in certain ways, by Pete's stories, and by her own history, and by the particular exhaustion of being a woman who had to earn the right to be seen clearly in every room she entered. She thought about how Rowan had arrived at that first night already carrying something he hadn't told her, already watching her from a specific angle she hadn't understood. There was no clean version of any of it. There was only the question of whether what had come out of it was real. She picked the pages back up and read the last section. It was short. He wrote that he wasn't asking for anything. He meant that she could hear it, the same flatness she'd heard in his voice when he said things he meant. He wasn't asking her to write back or to contact him or to keep him in her thoughts. He was asking for one thing only, which was for her to know, wherever she went and whatever she built, that there was a person in the world who had watched her closely for 47 days and come away with a clear, unromantic, accurate understanding of her quality, and that person's assessment was this: she was going to be all right. More than all right. You're going to build something, he wrote at the very end. I don't know what it is yet, but I know you will. And I hope, when you do, there's room in it for the occasional visitor who knows how to stay out of the way. She sat in the lamplight for a long time after she finished. Then she folded the pages carefully along the original creases and put them back in the envelope and put the envelope in the tin box where she kept her important documents and her savings and her mother's recipe pages. She turned the lamp down and went to sleep. She didn't write back. Not yet. She had work to do first. Dennard's Crossing in February was not a promising place. She'd known this going in, and she didn't revise her assessment once she arrived, because honesty about conditions was the first requirement for working with them. The main trail was slow, the cold was serious, the handful of residents who lived in the small cluster of buildings around the crossing were self-sufficient people who'd been self-sufficient long enough that they'd forgotten the habit of eating anywhere but their own tables. She opened anyway. She opened on a Monday in the first week of February, which was arbitrary, except that she needed to start generating income, and waiting for conditions to improve was a form of delay that she didn't have the savings to afford. She opened with a limited menu. 3 things, the things she could make reliably in the current kitchen and with current supplies. And she put a sign in the window that Vera at the trading post had helped her letter, and she started the stove at 4 in the morning and had food ready by 6. The first day, she served 4 people. 2 of them were Vera and a man who worked for Vera, which she suspected was charity, and accepted anyway because charity from people you respect is just community with a different name. The other 2 were a pair of freighters heading west who came in because of the sign and because it was cold, and they needed something hot. She made them cornbread and bean soup, because it was what she had, because it was what had worked before. They ate 2 helpings each and left a good tip and told her, at the door, that they came through Dennard's Crossing every couple of weeks. "We'll be back," one of them said. He meant it the way people mean things when the food is good enough that they stop being polite and start being sincere. "I'll be here," she said. That was the whole of the first day's triumph. 4 people and enough money to cover a quarter of the day's supplies. She sat in the empty restaurant after they'd gone and looked at the accounts and did the math and understood that this was going to take longer than she'd hoped, and that she was going to have to be very careful and very patient, and neither of those things was new to her, but they were also not easy. She kept opening every day. By the 3rd week, she was averaging 11 customers a day. Still not enough, but the direction was right. A ranching family from 6 miles out had started sending their hired man in every few days with orders to bring back food for supper, which was not how she'd planned to operate, but which she accommodated because a customer who paid reliably was worth accommodating. A man named Douglas, who ran the small freight office at the crossing, started eating lunch there every day without fanfare, just appearing at noon and sitting at the corner table and eating whatever she had and paying without complaint and leaving. She didn't know what had decided him. She didn't ask. She made sure his corner table was ready at noon. The restaurant didn't have a name for the first 3 weeks. She'd been calling it the place in her head, which was not a name. Vera asked her about it on a Thursday when Clara came by the trading post for supplies. "You need something on the sign," Vera said. "People need to be able to say where they ate. Word of mouth requires words." Clara thought about it that evening. She thought about her mother's recipe book with the water damage on the bottom corner. She thought about the cramped, careful handwriting of a woman who'd learned to write as an adult because she'd decided it was worth the effort, late as it was. She thought about what her mother would have called a place like this if she'd had the chance to build one. She painted Whitmore's on the sign the following morning, in plain black letters, before she opened. She stood back and looked at it. It was not fancy. It was her name, which was a thing she'd spent time in her life not saying out loud in certain rooms, and which she decided was going to be said out loud from now on. In every room, over the door of every place she built. She went inside and started the stove. March came in with a thaw that lasted 4 days, and then a freeze that came back harder, which was March's general personality, and which the frontier took as a matter of course. The cattle trail traffic picked up in the thaw, drovers moving early, pushing to get ahead of the season's uncertainty. And Clara cooked for 18 people in 1 day, and then 22 the day after, and ran out of cornbread by noon and had to send to Vera for more cornmeal and stayed up until 10 that night making bread for the next morning. She hired a girl named Patience, 14 years old, daughter of a homesteader family on the east side of the crossing, who needed the work and who had quick hands and a willingness to learn that Clara recognized and respected. Patience was not a skilled kitchen worker, but she was honest and showed up reliably and learned fast when something was shown to her twice. Clara showed her everything twice. The restaurant was still not profitable in any meaningful sense. She was covering costs and keeping a thin margin that she was saving against the next unexpected thing, because there was always a next unexpected thing, and the only question was what form it took. But it was growing. She could feel the growth in the way you feel things that are working, not in dramatic leaps, but in the slow accumulation of the ordinary, one reliable day after another. She thought about the letter every so often, not obsessively, she had too much to do for obsession, but steadily, the way you think about a door that isn't open yet. She'd read it 4 times now. She knew what it said. She was still, she realized, deciding what she thought about what it said, and she was trying to give the deciding the time it needed rather than rushing it into a conclusion because she was tired of the uncertainty. She'd learned over the course of her life that most of the mistakes she'd made had come from deciding things before she'd finished understanding them. She was trying to do better. The letter arrived from Iron Ridge in the middle of March. Not from Rowan, from Hatch, brief and practical in Hatch's manner, informing her that Dell had set a pot on the wrong burner and produced something he generously described as edible, that the south wall of the cookhouse had been fully repaired, and that the ranch was going adequately into the spring. At the end, 1 sentence, "Hale says to tell you the stove's behaving." She read that last sentence twice. She set the letter down and looked out the window of the restaurant at the trail road and the cold, muddy spring ground of Denard's Crossing, and she felt the thing she'd been keeping at distance come a little closer, warm and specific. She wrote back to Hatch. She told him the restaurant was growing. She told him Patience was coming along. She said to tell Rowan that she was glad the stove was behaving, and that the one in Denard's Crossing had a more cooperative personality, and that she'd recently figured out the molasses bread from memory, and it had come out right. She posted the letter and went back to work. Patek. He arrived on a Thursday in late April, which was not something she'd been expecting because she'd been trying not to expect it, because expecting specific things from specific people was one of the ways she'd learned to make herself vulnerable in ways she couldn't control. She was in the kitchen when she heard the door. Patience was out front managing the noon rush, which on a Thursday in late April was modest but real. She heard the door, and then she heard Patience say something, and then she heard a voice answer, and she went still with the spoon in her hand. She heard it through the wall, just the timbre of it, not the words. But she knew it. She set the spoon down. She picked it back up. She finished what she was doing, which was finishing, because the bread was at a stage that didn't allow for interruption, and she was not going to burn bread because someone had walked through her door. She was aware that this steadiness, this refusal to abandon the bread, was its own kind of statement about who she was now. She noted it and filed it. She finished the bread and slid it off the board and covered it and wiped her hands and went through the kitchen door into the front room. He was at the corner table. Not Douglas's corner. The other corner, the one by the east window that got the afternoon light. He was sitting with his hat off and his hands around a coffee cup that Patience had apparently provided, and he looked up when she came through the door. He looked different from February. Not dramatically. He was still himself, same build, same way of occupying a chair like he'd thought about it. But there was something settled in his face that hadn't been there before, or that she was seeing more clearly now that there wasn't a month's worth of complicated history making it hard to look at him straight. The burn scar on his hand was healing. She could see the edges of the new skin at his cuff. "You found it," she said. "Callum gave me directions," he said. He was very specific. Callum is always specific. "He said to tell you Douglas eats lunch in your corner now," Rowan said. He seemed to think that was significant information. "It is," she said. She sat down at the table across from him. Patience glanced over from where she was wiping the counter and then found something else to look at, with the particular discretion of a 14-year-old who has been paying attention. "How's the hand?" Claire asked. "Almost done healing," he said. "It worked all right through the spring work. A little stiff in the cold." She nodded. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her with the same patient quality he'd always had, not pushing, just present. "Why Thursday?" she said. "It's the day I could get away." "You own the ranch," she said. "You can get away any day." "Technically," he said, "but there's a difference between what's technically available and what actually makes sense for the work." He paused. "I didn't want to come until things were running well enough that I could leave without it falling apart. That turned out to be Thursday." She thought about that. She thought about the person she'd watched work for 47 days, the seriousness with which he approached everything he was responsible for, the way he'd chosen to earn the ranch instead of just owning it. That was not a performance. She'd been watching long enough to know the difference. "I got your letter," she said. "I know," he said. "You wrote to Hatch." "I did." "The molasses bread came out right," he said. "It did," she said. "I'll make it for you if you're staying for supper." Something moved in his face. Not the complicated things she'd been used to reading there, the guilt and the private weight. Something clearer. "I was hoping to stay for supper," he said. She looked at him. She looked at his face and the healing scar on his hand and the hat on the table between them, and the careful way he was holding still, not asking for anything, not leaning toward her with the weight of his wanting, just sitting there and letting her see him. She thought about what she'd needed to figure out. Who she was when she was none of those things. Not Pete's story, not Rowan's guilt, not the woman from the Monarch. She'd been figuring it out for 3 months in a cold restaurant on a cattle trail with a cracked window and a cooperative stove and a girl named Patience who was learning to make cornbread. She'd been figuring it out every morning when she lit the stove before dawn, and every evening when she locked the door and counted the day's money and wrote in the small notebook she kept of what had worked and what hadn't. What she'd found out was this. She was the woman who put her own name over the door. She was the woman who gave credit to a freighter's family when they were short and expected it back when they weren't. She was the woman who showed a 14-year-old how to hold a knife right and why it mattered. She was the woman who made her mother's bread from memory because she'd refused to let it be lost. She was not the woman from the Monarch. That woman had been real, and what had happened to her had been real, and it had cost something real. But she was not only that woman, she never had been. She thought about what Rowan had written. There was a person in the world who had watched her closely for 47 days and come away with a clear, unromantic, accurate understanding of her quality. She thought that was probably the most useful thing anyone had ever said about her. "All right," she said. "Supper. And after, I want to show you something." She nodded toward the back of the restaurant. "I've been thinking about what to do with the storage room. It's bigger than I need for just storage. I have an idea about it and I want a second opinion. He looked at her carefully, understanding that she was giving him something. Not everything, not a resolution, not a promise, but something. A door that wasn't closed. What kind of idea? He said. Come look at it after supper, she said. I'll explain. She stood up. She went back toward the kitchen. She stopped at the door and turned back once. Rowan. Yeah. I'm glad you came on a Thursday, she said. Thursdays are good days here. He almost smiled. It got further than usual. Good to know, he said. She went back into the kitchen and finished the bread. They talked through supper and past it, while Patience cleaned up and said goodnight, and let herself out with the careful quietness of someone being tactful, and the restaurant went dark except for their table and the lamp between them. She showed him the storage room. She'd drawn a rough plan of what she was thinking, a small bakery operation, separate from the main kitchen, that could produce bread for the households at the crossing and for the freighters who'd started asking if she sold bread by the loaf to take on the road. It required a second oven and some shelving and more capital than she currently had, but the math on it, she'd worked out, was sound. He looked at the plan. He asked 4 questions, practical ones, about the flue configuration and the supply sourcing and the demand projections she'd used. She answered them. He nodded at the answers in the way that meant he thought they were good answers. You need capital, he said. I know, she said. I'm building toward it. How long? At current pace, another 2 months before I have enough margin to commit. She paused. Unless the spring traffic is significantly better than I'm projecting, in which case 6 weeks. He looked at the rough plan again. He was quiet for a moment. I could... No, she said. He looked up. I know what you're going to offer, she said, and I know it comes from a good place, but I need this to be mine. You understand that. He held her eyes for a moment, then he nodded. I understand that, he said. You can help me think through it, she said. That's different. 2 sets of eyes on the math, 2 people arguing about the flue position. That's useful, and that's not the same as being funded by someone else. Fair distinction, he said. They talked about the flue position for 20 minutes and agreed on the east wall, which was what she'd originally thought and which he confirmed was right. And the conversation moved from there into other things. The spring trail traffic. What she'd learned about running a business versus working in one. What he'd learned about actually owning a ranch versus inheriting one. And the ways those 2 educations were more similar than they sounded. He was easier to talk to than she'd expected. She'd known him at Iron Ridge as a quiet person, and he was still quiet. He didn't fill silence for its own sake, and he didn't perform interest when he didn't have it. But she found that what he said, when he said it, was worth waiting for. He'd been paying attention to things his whole adult life, and he'd accumulated a practical understanding of how work worked, how people worked, how the gap between what you planned and what happened could be narrowed by preparation and stubbornness, and accepting that some of the gap was always going to remain. She told him about her mother. Not everything. Not in a single evening, because that wasn't how she told things. She told things in the order she trusted them out. But some of it. The recipe book with the water damage. The cramped handwriting. The woman who'd learned to write late because she decided it was worth it. She sounded like you, Rowan said. She was better than me, Clara said. How? Clara thought about it. She was more patient, she said. She didn't have the armor. The thing I do, where I decide in advance that I'm going to have to fight for everything, so I come in already fighting. She was more open than that. She let things come to her more. Maybe she could afford to be, Rowan said. Maybe you couldn't where you were. Clara looked at him. Maybe, she said. You can change which one you are, he said. You're not fixed. Nobody's fixed. She thought about that. She thought about the man who'd looked down at his plate in a Billings dining room and the man who'd crossed a room in 5 steps to put himself between her and Pete Dunmore. Same person. 2 versions of the same person, separated by time and the specific decision to become something different. She'd spent a lot of her life believing that people were mostly fixed, that who they showed you at the beginning was who they'd remain. It had been a useful belief because it simplified decisions. It was also, she was coming to understand, not entirely true. You should know something, she said. He waited. I've been angry at you, she said, about Billings. I want you to know that so there's no... So you're not operating without that information. She kept her eyes on his. Not constantly, not every day, but it's there, under everything else. I don't know how long it'll take to work through it. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to rush it. I know you're not, she said. I'm telling you anyway because I think you deserve to know what you're walking into, if you're walking into it. She paused. Are you walking into it? He looked at her across the small table with the lamp between them. Clara, he said, I walked 40 miles on a Thursday to eat supper and look at your storage room floor plan. What do you think? She looked at him for a moment, then she laughed. It came out before she decided on it. A real one, not performed, with actual air in it. It surprised her. He looked at her like the laugh was something he'd been working toward for a long time and hadn't been sure he'd ever see. I think, she said, getting the laugh under control, that you should come back next Thursday. I can do that, he said. And the Thursday after, she said. And we'll see. We'll see, he agreed. The Thursdays accumulated. There's not a cleaner way to say it. They accumulated the way decent things accumulate when you let them. Not rushing, not dramatizing, just one after another, building something through the repetition of showing up and being honest and doing the work. He came every Thursday he could, and some Tuesdays when the ranch allowed it, and she fed him supper and they talked about the bakery expansion and the trail traffic patterns and the things she was learning about running a business and the things he was learning about actually being who he'd decided to become. The bakery expansion happened in June with her own capital, on her own timeline, and the bread operation added 30% to her weekly income within 3 weeks, which was not as fast as the optimistic projection, but faster than the conservative one. By midsummer, Whitmore's had a reputation on the cattle trail that she could feel in how people talked about it, not as a place you stopped because it was there, but as a place you aimed for, a place you mentioned to other people heading through. The freighters told each other about it. Drovers who'd stopped once came back and brought new people. A family heading further west spent an afternoon with her talking about what she'd done and how, because the wife was thinking about something similar. And Clara told her everything she knew without holding any of it back, because she had not built this by hoarding what she'd learned. Patience turned 15 in August and had by then become a genuine asset in the kitchen, which Clara told her directly because the girl deserved to hear it. You've got good instincts, Clara said one morning when Patience had managed the whole breakfast service with minimal guidance. You trust them more now than you did in February. Patience looked at her, slightly embarrassed by the directness. You showed me what to trust, she said. I showed you what I know, Clara said. The trusting is yours. She told Rowan about the monarch herself, fully, in September. Not because she owed him the story. She'd spent enough of her life feeling like she owed people the story, like her history was a debt she had to discharge before she could occupy a room without apology. She told him because she'd decided that sharing it with someone she trusted was different from owing it to someone who was owed, and that the difference mattered. She told him on a Tuesday evening when the restaurant was closed and the lamp was low and the September air was coming through the cracked window she still hadn't replaced, because she'd gotten used to it and it let in the night sounds she'd come to like. The insects, the distant cattle, the ordinary sounds of a place that was alive. She told him all of it. He listened without interrupting, which was his particular quality. When she finished, he didn't say I'm sorry again, which she appreciated because he'd already said it and repetition would have made it smaller. What he said was, you were 20 years old. Yes. You didn't deserve any of it. No, she said. I didn't. Is there more? He said. More that you're carrying that I don't know? She thought about it honestly. Some, she said, but not tonight. All right, he said. She looked at him. You're not going to push on it. No. Why not? Because you'll tell me when you're ready, and I'd rather wait for that than know sooner and have you regret it, he said. I've had enough of getting the timing wrong. She held his eyes for a moment. You know, she said, for someone who spent 2 years trying to become someone worth knowing, you're doing a reasonable job. He looked at her. Reasonable, he said dryly. Don't push it, she said. The autumn deepened around them. The trail traffic held later into the season than it usually did because the weather was mild, and Whitmore's stayed busy into October in a way Clara hadn't planned for, and was grateful for in the way she was grateful for things now, which was practically and without taking them for granted. She replaced the cracked window in October, finally, because the nights were getting cold and practically required it. She felt obscurely sad about it for a day, and then she put the window in and the sound came through it differently, and she adjusted. Things changed, and you adjusted. This was not a profound truth. It was the most basic truth there was. But she had not always understood it in her body, in the daily texture of her life. She was understanding it better now. They married in November, which was Rowan's idea in the way things were his ideas. Stated plainly, without architecture, just a fact he'd arrived at and was offering. He said, "I want to marry you. I think we should. I'm not asking you to decide right now." She said, "I need a week." She took the week. She used it the way she used time she needed, not for drama, not for pacing rooms, but for thinking clearly about what she wanted and what she was afraid of, and whether the fear was the useful kind that meant something was genuinely dangerous, or the other kind, the kind she'd been carrying so long she'd mistaken it for wisdom. She'd been afraid of needing anyone for years. She'd built the fear into her structure and called it independence, and independence it was. Genuinely. She'd built something real. She'd done it herself, her name was on the door, but there was a version of independence that was a door you kept locked from the inside and called it choice, and she'd been honest enough with herself this week to ask which version she'd been living in. She thought about her mother, who had been more open than she was, who'd let things come to her. She thought about what that openness had cost her mother and what it had given her. She thought about the small green recipe book with the water damage and the cramped handwriting and the knowledge, carefully preserved, passed forward. You preserved what mattered by passing it on. You didn't protect it by keeping it locked where no one else could reach it. She told Rowan yes on a Thursday. The wedding was small, the way both of them wanted it. Vera and her husband. Hatch, who rode out from Iron Ridge with Callum, who wore the same expression at the wedding that he wore at everything, which was to say no expression in particular, though Clara noticed he stayed for the whole meal and had 3 pieces of cake. Patience and her parents. Douglas, who sat in the corner and ate steadily, and was, she'd come to understand, not a man who showed what he felt except by showing up, which she recognized as a valid approach. She wore the dress she'd bought in October from a seamstress in Ridgeback, blue-gray wool, practical and good. Rowan wore his best coat and a clean shirt and the look of a man who had gotten somewhere he'd spent a long time trying to get to and was not taking it for granted. It was not a perfect day. The weather turned cold in the afternoon, and the stove in the restaurant, where they held the small reception, had one of its occasional temperamental moments and smoked for 20 minutes before resolving itself. She'd burned the first batch of rolls because she'd been distracted talking to Vera and had to make a second batch. Callum, typically, said nothing about either of these things, and the second batch was fine. None of it mattered, or rather, all of it mattered in exactly the right way, in the way that real things matter, imperfect and present and genuinely happening. She looked at Rowan across the table during the supper, at his face in the lamplight, and she thought about all of it. The 11 miles in December, the stove that needed coaxing, the beans sorted at the work table, the porch step fixed, the envelope in her pocket that had carried enough honesty to outlast her defenses. She thought about what she'd learned, not as a lesson you could write out in clean sentences, but as a thing lived and understood through the living of it, that people were not fixed, that the person who sat still in a room while something wrong happened could become, through choice and time and the specific willingness to look at themselves honestly, the person who crossed the room, that this change was real and it cost something and it deserved to be taken seriously, that the woman who arrived at a place with nothing but a worn satchel and the refusal to be made smaller than she was could build something out of that refusal, could make it into bread and open doors and a name on a sign. That belonging was not something you were given or taken from. It was something you made, one ordinary day after another, through the work of being present and honest and willing to stay. She had stayed. That was the thing, at the bottom of all of it. She had stayed when the reasonable thing was to leave, and she had left when leaving was the honest thing. And she had built something out of both decisions, and she was still building. Rowan caught her looking at him and held her eyes across the table, and she didn't look away, and after a moment he raised his coffee cup slightly, a small private gesture, just for her. She raised hers back. Outside, the November wind worked against the walls of Whitmore's, the way the Montana wind always worked, hard, without apology, testing everything for weakness. The building held. She'd known it would. She checked the structure herself before she signed the lease, pressed her hands against the walls in the places that mattered, felt for the give that would tell her it wasn't sound. It was sound, not perfect. There was a soft spot in the floor near the east window she was planning to fix in spring, and the roof would need work eventually, and there were always more things to do than time to do them. But it held. It held, and inside it was warm, and the people she'd chosen were around her table, and her name was on the door, and the bread she'd made from her mother's recipe was on the plate in front of her. And the woman who'd once been defined by other people's stories about her had written, over several months of hard and ordinary work, a different story. Not a perfect one. She wasn't interested in perfect. She was interested in true. And this, the warm room, the held walls, the man across the table who had spent 2 years becoming someone worth trusting and had then trusted her enough to say so, this was true. This was enough. This, she thought, was the beginning of more than enough.